The courtroom reverberated with the sharp, unmistakable crack of a hand meeting flesh, a sound so jarring it seemed to fracture the very air. A collective gasp erupted from the onlookers, their breaths catching in their throats as the echo lingered, a haunting reminder of what had just transpired. This room, with its polished wood paneling and high ceilings, had long stood as a bastion of law and order, a place where justice was supposed to reign supreme. Yet, in an instant, it had transformed into something far uglier, a theater for a shameful display of brutality that would sear itself into the memory of everyone present. The man who had delivered the blow towered over his target, his crisp uniform pristine, the badge pinned to his chest glinting ominously under the harsh fluorescent lights. His face was a mask of arrogance, his lips twisting into a sneer of contempt as he glared down at the black woman he had just struck. The venom in his voice was palpable as he barked, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Know your place, lady. You people are always stirring up trouble. You think you can just waltz in here like you belong?" His words dripped with a superiority so ingrained it felt like second nature to him, each syllable a calculated jab meant to degrade and diminish. For a fleeting moment, silence descended like a heavy fog, smothering the room in its oppressive weight. The murmurs of attorneys, the rustling of papers from clerks, and the whispers of spectators in the galleria of it stilled, as if the sheer audacity of the act had robbed them of their voices. No one dared move, their eyes wide with disbelief, their minds struggling to process the scene unfolding before them. The woman, however, stood resolute, her posture unyielding despite the sharp sting blooming across her cheek. She didn't flinch, didn't cower. Her dark eyes, deep and unreadable, locked onto the officers with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his bravado. The courtroom was brimming with people-layers in pressed suits, police officers in their starched uniforms, witnesses fidgeting nervously, and journalists poised with notepads in handle of them, ensnared by the gravity of the moment. Some cast quick, anxious glances toward the judge's bench, their hearts pounding as they waited for the figure of authority to intervene, to bring order back to this chaos. But the chair sat empty, a void where justice should have been, and a creeping unease began to slither through the crowd, like a cold wind slipping beneath a doorframe. The realization dawned slowly, chilling the room further. People exchanged furtive looks, their brows furrowing as the weight of something unspoken settled over them. The clerks, seasoned veterans of this courthouse with decades of experience etched into their weary faces, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their fingers tightening around pens and files. The officers scattered throughout the room, who moments ago had lounged with the casual confidence of men accustomed to wielding power, now stood rigid, their spines stiffening as if they sensed a storm brewing just beyond their grasp. Something was terribly amiss, and they could feel an instinct honed by years of navigating tense situations, now screaming that the ground beneath them was shifting. The woman's presence had been magnetic from the moment she entered, a quiet force that demanded attention without ever raising her voice. Yet this officer, blinded by his own assumptions, had dismissed her outright. He had acted without hesitation, his hand lashing out as if it were his right, his privilege. Now, the consequences of that reckless arrogance were about to unravel in a way that would leave no one untouched. She moved then, her actions deliberate and unhurried, as if time itself bent to her will. Her fingers brushed lightly against her cheek, tracing the warm, tender spot where his hand had landed, and the room seemed to hold its breath, every eye riveted to her. She took a single step forward, closing the distance between herself and the officer, her gaze never wavering. "Did you just put your hands on me?" Her voice was low, steady, a quiet thunder that rumbled with controlled fury. There was no tremble, no hesitation, just a cold, unyielding edge that made the hairs on the back of necks stand on end. The officer scoffed, his chest puffing out as he tried to reclaim his dominance. "You're lucky that's all I did. You people never listen unless we force you tostrating around here like you own the damn place." His bravado faltered slightly, a crack in his armor, but he pressed on, unwilling to back down. The murmurs in the room grew louder, a restless energy stirring among the crowd. Someone in the jury box shifted, their chair creaking under the tension. A reporter's pen scratched furiously against paper, capturing every word, every breath, as if sensing history was being written in real time. The woman inhaled deeply, her chest rising with a slow, deliberate calm that sent a shiver of unease rippling through the onlookers. Then, with a grace that belied the violence she'd just endured, she turned her gaze past the officer, her eyes locking onto the court bailiff standing near the back. "Is this how officers behave in my courtroom?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air like a blade honed to perfection. A sharp, collective inhale sounded from the rear of the room, and the officer's face drained of color, his skin paling to a sickly white. His body stiffened, his broad shoulders locking as if his very skeleton had turned to stone. It was the kind of reaction born from the sudden, gut-wrenching realization that he had misjudged everything standing, not just on the wrong side of justice, but on the precipice of his own undoing. "My courtroom," he stammered, his voice wavering as confusion flickered across his features. He shook his head, trying to dismiss her words. "What the hell are you talking about?" And then it happened. She turned slightly, her movements fluid yet commanding, and took another step forward. This time, she didn't merely stand, she ascended. With an authority that radiated from her very being, she walked past the officer, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, each sound a declaration of purpose. She stepped onto the raised platform where the judge's bench loomed, and the silence that followed was deafening, a void so profound it seemed to swallow every whisper, every heartbeat. She turned slowly, facing the room, her presence filling the space like a tidal wave. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the truth settled over them all. She was no longer just a victim, no longer just a black woman disrespected in a space meant to uphold fairness. She was the law incarnate, the embodiment of justice standing tall in the face of prejudice and power misused. The moment stretched on, an eternity encapsulated in seconds, and the officer felt the weight of it crash down upon him like a hammer shattering glass. His jaw clenched, his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, but there was no escaping it. She straightened, letting the full magnitude of her authority settle over the room. "I am the judge of this court," she declared, her voice slicing through the silence with surgical precision. "And you, officer, have just assaulted me in front of an entire courtroom of witnesses." A shockwave of gasps tore through the space, a pen clattered to the floor, and the reporter's scribbling reached a fevered pitch. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to one another as the reality sank in. Their colleague had just committed an unforgivable blunder, one that would echo far beyond these walls. The man who had stood so tall only moments ago seemed to shrink, his face contorting with a volatile mix of rage and panic. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "There's no way." "Would you like to say that louder, officer?" Her tone was steel, unyielding, a challenge laced with the promise of retribution. "Would you like to continue digging your own grave?" His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His fingers twitched at his sides, restless and impotent. For years, he had walked these halls with the swagger of a man untouchable, his power unquestioned, his authority feared. But now, in the span of a single heartbeat, that power had been stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable before the very system he had abused. The silence stretched unbearably, a taut wire ready to snap. Then, with a measured grace, she took her seat behind the bench, her rightful place. "Now," she said, her hands clasped calmly before her, "shall we proceed?" The officer barely moved, his mind a whirlwind of desperation and denial. "Or do I need to have you arrested?" A shudder rippled through the room. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, and reporters whispered frantically into their recorders. The lawyers present exchanged knowing glances, already mentally drafting motions and arguments. The jury members sat wide-eyed, their faces etched with the indelible mark of what they had witnessed. And the officer stood frozen, his thoughts racing, searching for an escape that didn't exist. This wasn't just a fleeting embarrassment or a minor reprimand. This was the moment his entire life unraveled, the consequences of his actions poised to cascade like dominoes. The city outside pulsed on, its rhythm unbroken, a chaotic symphony of ambition and struggle, where skyscrapers loomed over neglected streets and justice often felt like a distant promise. But here, within these cold stone walls, a reckoning had begun. Judge Naomi, a woman who had clawed her way up from the shadows of that same city, knew the stakes all too well. She had seen the law twisted into a weapon against those who looked like her, watched as dignity was stripped away under the guise of order. Yet she had fought, not just to survive, but to wield that same law as a shield for others. Now, as she sat in judgment, her presence was a testament to resiliency and a warning. Power, when abused, carried a price, and justice, when provoked, would not be denied. The officer's fate hung in the balance, a thread yet to be cut. But one thing was certain: the story was far from its end, and its lesson saw of accountability, of consequence, of the unyielding strength of those who refused to be broken would resonate long after the gavel fell. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Naomi Ellis rose from her bed, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though each step was a quiet rebellion against a world that had never intended for her to succeed. She had spent years clawing her way up, proving her worth time and again, transforming herself from a wide-eyed girl who dreamed of fairness into a woman whose presence alone could silence a room. Now, she sat behind the judge's bench, a throne of sorts. Though one hard-earned and bitterly contested, the courtroom was her domain, yet true respect, she had come to realize, was a currency rarely offered freely, especially to a black woman in a space where whispers still lingered about how someone like her could have claimed such authority. Her life was a symphony of discipline, coffee brewed at precisely 6 a.m., its bitter aroma curling through the quiet of her apartment, a meticulous review of the day's cases by 6:30, her pen scratching notes in the margins, and a solitary run before dawn, her breath fogging in the crisp air as she pounded the pavement, reclaiming control over her body and mind in a world that so often sought to strip it away. By 8 a.m., she was in her chambers, a sanctuary carved out of chaos, its walls lined with leather-bound tomes, laws penned by men who'd never envisioned her wielding them. Her desk stood as a testament to her precision, case files stacked with military neatness, a single framed photograph of her late father gazing down at her, his stern eyes a constant reminder that justice wasn't a gift bestowed, it was a prize seized. Across the city, Officer Daniel Whitaker strode through the precinct, his boots echoing on the linoleum with the unshakable confidence of a man who'd never known doubt. A veteran of the force, he'd spent decades patrolling streets he saw as a battlefield teetering on the brink of anarchy, viewing himself as the iron fist needed to hold it all together. His broad shoulders and steely glare were his tools of trade, his toughness a badge he wore with pride. Once, long ago, he'd believed in the lofty ideals he'd sworn to protect: justice, order, the thin blue line. But years of grit and grime had worn those ideals down to something rawer, something uglier. To him, justice wasn't a delicate dance of rules and rights. It was a hammer, blunt and unyielding. He had little patience for the courtroom's intricatularies twisting truths into knots. Judges perched on high who, in his mind, cared more about optics than outcomes. He'd watched too many good officers slapped with reprimands, too many cases crumble over petty technicalities. The judges, cloaked in their black robes, were soft. He thought out-of-touch bureaucrats playing at power while he did the real work. Today, his irritation simmered hotter than usual. The case dragging him to court was a no-brainer, a repeat offender, a young black man he'd hauled in before, caught dead to rights. Whitaker had made the arrest himself, ensured the paperwork was airtight. It should have been over and done with, a clean win. Yet here he was, summoned to a courtroom he barely tolerated, forced to wait for some judge to rubber stamp what he already knew. He'd done his damn job. The courthouse hummed with restless energy as Naomi arrived, its corridors alive with the shuffle of attorneys clutching briefcases, clients fidgeting on worn benches, and officers cutting through the crowd with clipped strides. This was the machinery of justice, creaking and relentless, and she navigated it with the grace of someone who'd long since mastered its rhythm. She nodded to familiar faces, clerks who'd come to admire her, assistants who'd learned to anticipate her needs, every gesture a quiet assertion of authority. She'd honed this presence over years, learning to carry herself with a dignity that brooked no challenge, her head held high, her steps measured and sure. Yet no matter how far she rose, there were always those who saw her as an intruder, attorneys who interrupted her mid-sentence, defendants who sneered at her rulings, older judges who waved her off as too green, too untested. And then there were the officersmen like Whitaker, their prejudices worn like medals, their eye rolls and muttered jabs about activist judges a constant undercurrent. She'd seen his name before, buried in reports thick with complaints that somehow never stuck, vanishing into the ether of a system that protected its own. Officers like him swaggered into her courtroom, cloaked in arrogance, certain their badge made them untouchable. She'd spent her career dismantling that illusion, one ruling at a time, forcing them to reckon with a law they couldn't bend. Today, though, would be no ordinary reckoning. Whitaker had no inkling of the storm brewing as he sat in the courtroom, arms crossed, jaw tight, his patience fraying with every tick of the clock. Naomi wasn't yet at the bench when it happened. She'd paused near the clerk's desk, skimming a last-minute motion, her brow furrowed in concentration. The air was thick with the day's tension, voices overlapping in a low drone. Then, in a flash, it shattered. Whitaker, brushing past her in a huff, perhaps a muttered curse under his breath, perhaps nothing at all, swung his hand with casual brutality, the crack of his palm against her cheek slicing through the room like a gunshot. The sting bloomed across her skin, sharp and searing, but it was the gasp of the crowd that echoed loudest, a collective intake of breath as every eye snapped to the scene. Conversations died mid-word, papers stilled in trembling hands, the world tilting on its axis. Naomi stood frozen for a heartbeat, her fingers brushing the tender spot where his hand had landed, her gaze locking onto his. Inside her, something ignited, not a wild, reckless fury, but a cold, surgical rage, honed to a razor's edge. Whitaker's face twitched, a flicker of confusion darting across his features, then defiance, his fists balling at his sides as if daring her to react. The room held its breath, the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm cloud. Eyes darted between theme attorneys, clerks. Spectators saw, caught in a tangle of shock and anticipation. The bailiff, Carter, a burly man with a gentle soul, took a tentative step forward, his broad frame hesitant. "Judge Ellis," he murmured, voice low and unsteady, "do you want me to?" Her stare never wavered from Whitaker. "Stand down," she said, her tone a blade of ice cutting through the haze. Carter faltered, then retreated, his boots scuffing the floor. The defense attorney, a weary figure drowning in a cheap suit, dabbed at the sweat beading on his temple, his nerves betraying him. The prosecutor, a man who prided himself on his unshakable calm, clenched his jaw, his mask slipping. Whitaker, though, couldn't stay silent. "This is," he started, his voice a growl laced with venom, his lips curling into a sneer. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not here for your political stunts." Naomi let his words hang, unanswered, her silence a weapon sharper than any retort. It gnawed at him, that stillness, could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his bravado faltered. He was a man accustomed to dominating every room, every encounter, but here, control slipped through his grasp like sand. "You expect me to apologize?" he spat, shifting his weight, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and scorn. "Because I won't. I don't apologize for doing my job." Naomi's brow lifted, her expression a mask of cool detachment, though beneath it, her mind churned with the weight of what lay ahead. The slap still burned, a dull throb pulsing against her cheek, but she refused to give it power. The courtroom buzzed louder now, whispers swelling into a current of unease. She let the silence stretch further, let Whitaker stew in it, let him believe just for a fleeting second that he might walk away unscathed. Then she spoke, her voice steady, resonant, slicing through the tension like a guillotine. "Officer Whitaker," she began, each syllable deliberate, "today, you'll learn that justice isn't yours to define." The room stilled again, every soul leaning in, sensing the shift. This wasn't just a reprimand, it was a reckoning, a lesson etched in the consequences of unchecked power, a reminder that the law, in her hands, was a force neither he nor anyone else could escape. The air in the courtroom crackled with tension as Rose's voice rose, sharp and jagged, fueled by a frustration that had been simmering far too long. She glared at Officer Daniel Whitaker, her words spilling out like a dam finally breaking. "You stride in here with that swagger, like the whole world bends to your will, like you're somehow perched above us all. You think you're untouchable, don't you? That you can just waltz through life with a free pass because what, officer?" Her tone trembled with indignation, her chest tightening as she watched him, waiting for the excuse she knew would come. Whitaker stood there, his broad frame rigid, his fists balled so tightly the knuckles blanched white against his weathered skin. His face flickered not with guilt, no, never guilt, but with something softer, something fleeting, like the shadow of doubt creeping across a sunlit wall. He parted his lips as if to fire back, then snapped them shut again, the muscles in his jaw flexing as he wrestled with the storm brewing inside him. The room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes darting between him and the woman who stood poised to dismantle his world. Naomi, unfazed, let her voice cut through the silence, steady as a blade and cool as the polished oak beneath her feet. "Because I'm a black woman," she said, her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone dropped into still water. "Because I don't match the picture you've painted in your head of what power is supposed to look like." Her calm was a stark contrast to his unraveling, her presence a quiet force that made his outburst seem frantic, almost pitiful. She took a slow, measured step toward the judge's bench, her heels striking the gleaming floor with a sharp click-click-click that echoed through the chamber. The sound was crisp, intentional, a metronome marking the rhythm of her authority. With a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, Naomi ascended the platform, her robe swaying slightly as she moved. She settled into the high-backed chair behind the bench, her hands folding together with a gentle precision, fingers lacing as though she were weaving the threads of justice itself. The moment she sat, the weight of the situation crashed down on Whitaker like a tidal wave breaking over a crumbling shore. His chest heaved, his breath catching as the reality of what he'd done off who he dared to strike settled around him, heavy and unyielding, like iron chains locking into place. The courtroom fell silent, a suffocating stillness that pressed against every onlooker. Attorneys froze mid-shuffle, their pens hovering over legal pads. Reporters clutched their notebooks, eyes wide, breath held, as if afraid to disturb the scene unfolding before them. Every gaze was pinned on Whitaker, the man who, in a fleeting burst of arrogance, had laid hands on a sitting judge. His uniform, once a symbol of control, now seemed to mock him, its crisp lines and gleaming badge a hollow shell against the enormity of his mistake. Naomi exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to steady the room itself. Her fingers rested lightly on the bench, and when she spoke, her voice carried the unshakable authority that had commanded courtrooms for decades. "Let's get one thing straight, Officer Whitaker," she began, her tone firm but not loud, resonating with the power of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. "This isn't your precinct. You don't get to decide who belongs in this space. You don't get to determine who deserves respect. And you absolutely do not put your hands on a sitting judge without facing the consequences." Whitaker's nostrils flared, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. He wanted to speak, his lips twitched with the urge, but he held his tongue, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Naomi let it linger, her dark eyes studying him, taking in the way his fists trembled, the way his defiance flickered like a candle caught in a draft. Then, with a patience that bordered on merciless, she continued, "I'm not someone who acts on impulse. That's your approach, not mine. So let me pose a simple question. Officer Whitaker, do you truly understand the gravity of what you've done here today?" His eyes blazed with a stubborn fire, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack under the pressure. "I did my job," he spat, the words rough and raw, scraping against the quiet of the room. Naomi tilted her head ever so slightly, her gaze sharpening as she regarded him, dissecting the flimsy shield of his excuse. "Your job," she repeated, her voice low and edged with disbelief. "So your job includes assaulting people without knowing who they are, without facts, without control." His face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck, but before he could muster a defense, she cut him off, her tone slicing through the air like a whip. "Enough." The room seemed to inhale as one, a collective gasp swallowed by the weight of her command. No one had ever witnessed a moment quite like this, a clash of power so raw, so visceral. It felt as though the very walls of the courthouse trembled. Naomi's voice softened, but it lost none of its strength. "You walked into this courtroom today carrying a preconceived notion of who belongs where. You acted on that assumption without hesitation, and now here you stand, grappling with a world that suddenly slipped out of your grasp. Whitaker's fingers twitched, his hands flexing as if itching to reclaim the control he'd lost. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice thick with resentment. "You think you can do whatever you want just because enough." Naomi's interruption was swift, her tone a gavel strike that silenced him mid-sentence. Though she didn't raise her voice, the finality in it was absolute, leaving no crack for him to slip through. He sucked in a sharp breath, his chest rising and falling unevenly, but he said nothing more, his defiance teetering on the edge of collapse. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the bench, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made the air feel thick. "Here's what's going to happen next," she said, her words slow and deliberate, each one a brick laid in the foundation of his reckoning. "You're going to step back. You're going to sit down. And we're going to proceed as the law demands. Do you understand me, officer?" For the first time since he'd struck her, Whitaker faltered. It wasn't just her words, it was the weight behind them, the unshakable certainty that rolled off her like a tide. He'd spent years wielding power, years bending rooms to his will with a glare or a barked command, years making others shrink beneath his shadow. But now, in this moment, he was the one diminishing. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple, glistening under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, and then, with a reluctance that seemed to pain him, he took a step back. His boots scraped against the floor, a grating sound that echoed in the stillness, and he lowered himself into a chair, his movements stiff, his face twisting into a grimace of barely contained fury. Naomi exhaled quietly, a subtle release of tension that went unnoticed by most, but she wasn't done. Because while Whitaker might have grasped that he'd lost this battle, he hadn't yet fathomed the full scope of what lay ahead. The true consequences of his actions' devastating fallout were still gathering on the horizon, a storm he couldn't yet see, but would soon feel in every bone of his body. The room remained thick with anticipation, every spectator caught in the grip of what was to come. Whitaker sat there, his posture rigid, his fingers twitching against the armrests, betraying the turmoil churning within him. He'd built his career on the belief that he was untouchable, a fortress of authority no one could breach. But now, the walls were closing in, and when they finally crushed him, they'd leave nothing of the man he'd thought himself to be. Across the room, Naomi remained a pillar of composure, her expression unreadable as she watched him squirm. She'd encountered men like him before, too many to count, men who brandished their power like a club, who wore their privilege like armor, certain it would shield them from accountability. They always thought they held the upper hand, that the system would twist itself to protect them. Until it didn't. Until they crashed headlong into someone like her, someone who refused to bend, who stood firm as the bedrock of justice itself. And now Whitaker was beginning to see a realization dawning in the tightness of his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes that this wasn't a fight he could win. "Officer Whitaker," she said at last, her voice cutting through the haze of his thoughts, each syllable measured and resolute. "You seem to be under the impression that your badge excuses what happened here today, that your uniform somehow lifts you above the consequences of your actions. But let me make this abundantly clear. I'm about to shatter that illusion." He exhaled sharply, his frustration boiling over, his fists curling tighter as he leaned forward in his chair. "You don't get to turn this into some grand lecture on justice," he snapped, his voice rough with desperation. "You want to make an example out of me? Fine, go ahead. But don't sit there pretending this is about fairness." Naomi's expression didn't waver, but a spark flared in her eyes, a glint of steel that made even the seasoned attorneys sit up straighter, their pens pausing mid-scratch. "Fairness?" she echoed, her tone laced with a quiet incredulity that cut deeper than any shout. "You assaulted a sitting judge in front of a room full of witnesses, and you dare to speak to me about fairness?" His lips parted, but she pressed on, her gaze unyielding. "If you'd done this to any other judge if this bench were occupied by a white mondo, you honestly believe you'd still be sitting there, free to argue your case?" A muscle ticked in Whitaker's jaw, his silence a grudging admission of the truth she'd laid bare. Naomi straightened, her hands smoothing the cuffs of her robe with a deliberate calm. "I've spent my life watching men like you twist the law to suit your biases, abusing the power entrusted to you. I've presided over countless cases where officers swore they'd done no wrong, only for the evidence to unravel their lies when someone finally bothered to look. I've heard every excuse, every justification, every hollow apology. But today, there's no excuse. There's no justification. There's only what you did. Officer Whitaker, and the fact that you've made the gravest mistake of your life. His breathing grew ragged, the arrogance that had once defined him slipping away like smoke through his fingers. The power in the room had shifted irrevocably, and he could feel the reporters scribbling furiously, the attorneys exchanging hushed glances, the air itself thickening with the promise of his downfall. Naomi let the silence settle, a heavy pause that amplified the weight of her words. Then, turning to the court clerk, she spoke with unwavering resolve. "Miss Davidson, please take note. I am issuing an immediate judicial order for Officer Daniel Whitaker to be detained in contempt of court and formally charged with assault against a public official, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the room, soft but electric, as the reality of her ruling sank in. Whitaker's head jerked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, but Naomi's gaze never wavered. She sat back, her hands resting lightly on the bench, her posture a testament to the justice she embodied, a justice that didn't bend for arrogance or power, a justice that demanded accountability no matter who stood in its path. For Whitaker, the lesson was clear: abuse your authority, and the consequences will find you. Relentless and unforgiving. And as the bailiff stepped forward to escort him away, the room held its breath, knowing this was only the beginning of the reckoning to come. The courtroom erupted in a visceral, electric jolt the moment the verdict sliced through the air, a shockwave of raw disbelief rippling outward like a stone hurled into still water. Faces turned pale, mouths hung open, and eyes darted wildly as the weight of what had just transpired settled into the room. The best friend of the accused, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually furrowed brow, sat frozen in his seat, his body stiffening as though his spine had turned to steel. His gaze flickered frantically between Naomi, the judge who had just spoken, and Whitaker, the man at the center of this storm, as if silently pleading for someone to tell him this was all a cruel misunderstanding. Even the defense attorney, a weary figure who had spent most of the trial slouched in his chair, scribbling notes and avoiding eye contact, couldn't hide his reaction. He shifted uncomfortably, his thin lips parting slightly, a faint gasp escaping as his pen hovered uselessly over his legal pad. Whitaker himself seemed to crumple inward, the color draining from his weathered face until he looked like a ghost of the man who had strode into the courtroom hours earlier, brimming with unshakable confidence. "You can't be serious," he muttered, his voice barely audible, a hoarse whisper that trembled with a mix of disbelief and dread. His hands, once steady and commanding, now gripped the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. But Naomi's eye sharp, unyielding, and piercing didn't waver for a second. She sat tall behind the bench, her dark robe a stark contrast to the polished wood beneath her hands, and her voice carried a quiet, unshakable resolve. "Oh, I am very serious, Officer Whitaker," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the haze of tension like a finely honed blade. "For far too long, men like you have operated under the delusion that your actions carry no weight. That power shields you from accountability. I refuse to let this courtroom, this moment, become yet another footnote in a long history of justice bending to protect the powerful. Not today, not this time." Whitaker's entire frame went rigid, his shoulders squaring as though preparing to absorb a physical blow. Inside his mind, a frantic scramble unfolded, thoughts racing, clawing at the edges of his consciousness for some way out, some loophole or lifeline to pull him from the abyss yawning before him. His eyes darted toward the other officers scattered around the room, men he'd worked alongside for years, men he'd shared late-night shifts and bitter coffee with. Surely they'd step in, offer a nod of solidarity, a subtle signal that they had his back. But they didn't. They stood like statues, their faces carved from stone, their silence louder than any protest could have been. Disappointment curdled in his chest, mingling with a rising tide of panic. "Baith," Naomi's voice rang out again, sharp and commanding, slicing through the suffocating stillness. "Escort Officer Whitaker into custody." The officer she addressed, Carter, hesitated for the briefest of moments, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his weathered face. He was a man of routine, a veteran who followed orders without question, but even he seemed to feel the gravity of this order. His boots scuffed softly against the floor as he stepped forward, his movements slow and methodical. Yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, perhaps recognition, that this wasn't just another rest, but a turning point, a crack in the foundation of everything Whitaker had built. Whitaker exploded from his seat, the chair skidding backward with a harsh, grating screech that echoed off the high ceilings. "This is," he roared, his voice splintering under the strain, raw and ragged with desperation. "You're ruining my career over what? A misunderstanding." His chest heaved, his breaths coming in short, jagged bursts as he loomed over the table, a man unraveling before the eyes of everyone present. Naomi remained seated, her posture calm, her face an unreadable mask of composure. She watched him, studied him, as Carter closed the distance with steady, unhurried steps. "I've served this city for 20 years, Whitaker spat, his voice rising, a frantic edge creeping in as he gestured wildly with his hands. "I've arrested criminals, real criminals. I've put my life on the line, day after day, and now you're treating me like some street thug." His words hung in the air, heavy with indignation, but Naomi didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes narrowing as she regarded him with a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller, the air tighter. "Tell me, Officer Whitaker," she said, her tone soft but laced with a lethal precision. "How many people have you hauled into this very courtroom, shouting those exact same words? How many begged you to see their side, swore they were innocent, only to watch you turn away?" The question landed like a sledgehammer. Whitaker flinched, a subtle recoil that rippled through his frame, his face twisting into a snarl of rage, and something else, a something that looked dangerously close to realization. His mouth opened, a retort poised on his tongue, but before he could spit it out, Carter's hand clamped down on his arm. "Let's go," Carter said, his voice flat, professional, devoid of the camaraderie Whitaker had expected. Whitaker jerked against the grip, his muscles tensing, but Carter's hold was unrelenting, a quiet strength that brooked no resistance. The metallic snap of handcuffs rang out, sharp and final, reverberating through the courtroom like a gunshot. Whitaker's face contorted, his body trembling with barely suppressed fury as the cold steel bit into his wrists. "You're making a mistake," he growled, his voice low and venomous, his eyes blazing with defiance. "This isn't over." Naomi met his stare one final time, her expression as steady as ever, her voice a calm, resolute anchor in the chaos. "No," she said simply, "it isn't," as Carter guided him toward the door. The murmurs in the gallery swelled, a low hum of astonishment and unease spreading through the onlookers. The full weight of what had just happened crashed over the room, like a tidal wave. Justice had been served, swift and unflinching. But the ripples of this moment would stretch far beyond these walls. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitaker was about to taste the bitter sting of powerlessness, a sensation he'd spent decades inflicting on others without a second thought. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were pressing inward. Earlier, when the slap had echoed through the spacious, sharp, resounding crack that had stunned everyone into silent sight, had been a fleeting shock. Now, that initial jolt had morphed into something darker, more suffocating, a stillness that clung to the skin and sank into the bones. Whitaker sat rigid in his chair once more, replaying the moment in his mind, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, his fingers digging into the armrests until his knuckles blanched white. For years, he'd strode through life with an effortless authority, his badge a shield, his presence a command. Courtrooms, precincts, city streets, they'd all bent to his will. But now, the ground beneath him had shifted, the territory he'd claimed as his own slipping away like sand through his fingers. Judge Naomi Ellis leaned forward slightly from her perch, her gaze locking onto him with the precision of a predator sizing up its prey. There was no malice in her eyes, no petty vengeance, just the cold, unwavering clarity of justice finally catching up to a man who'd outrun it for too long. The room buzzed with unspoken tension, every breath, every rustle of paper amplified in the thick silence. The clerks at their desks stole glances at one another, their pens hovering over documents they'd stopped writing. The attorneys, usually so quick with objections and arguments, sat mute, their eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing history unfold. Even the reporters in the back row, seasoned veterans of countless trials, scribbled furiously, their pencils scratching against notepads as they raced to capture every word, every gesture. Naomi exhaled slowly, her breath a deliberate release of the storm building within her. Her hands rested lightly on the polished bench, fingers splayed against the wood as though grounding herself in its solidity. "Officer Whitaker," she began, her voice steady, each syllable measured with the weight of inevitability. "Do you understand where you are right now?" His eyes snapped to hers, dark pools swirling with defiance and something murkier, perhaps, or the dawning of a truth he'd refused to face. He let out a sharp, bitter breath, the muscles in his neck cording with tension. "This is a joke," he muttered, the words slipping out under his breath, barely audible but dripping with contempt. Naomi arched a brow, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a living thing, coiling around them all. "A joke," she repeated, her tone even, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet force that shrank the room and tightened the air. "Let me make something perfectly clear. Officer, you're sitting in my courtroom, facing the direct consequences of your own actions you chose, actions you carried out in front of dozens of witnesses. I need you to grasp that fully before we go any further." Whitaker barked a short, hollow laugh, shaking his head as though he could dismiss her words with the gesture alone. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said, his voice dropping lower, a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of control. "We both know how this works. You give your little speech, flex your authority, and then I walk out of here like nothing happened. That's how it's always been." The gallery erupted in a chorus of gasps and murmurs, heads shaking in disbelief at the sheer gall of his words, the audacity. The arrogant sight hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Naomi let the noise settle, her gaze never leaving his, her calm unshaken. "You think you're untouchable," she said at last, her voice sharpening, cutting through the haze like a drawn sword. "You genuinely believe that no matter what happens here today, no matter the evidence, no matter the truth, you'll walk out of this courtroom unscathed? Because that's what you've always known, isn't it?" Whitaker held her stare, but a flicker danced in his eyes, a crack in his armor. He was listening now, even if every fiber of his being screamed against it. "That's why you felt bold enough to strike me in front of an entire courtroom," Naomi continued, her voice steady, relentless. "You were so certain there'd be no repercussions, so convinced the system would wrap its arms around you and shield you, just like it always has." His jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as a bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple. "But there's a problem," she said, leaning in just slightly, her eyes boring into his. "You made a mistake, a fatal one, and I'm not talking about the slap." He shifted in his seat, discomfort creeping into his rigid posture. "You assumed," Naomi pressed on, her words slow and deliberate, each one a hammer striking stone. "You assumed I was someone you could overpower, someone you could belittle, someone you could humiliate without consequence. But what you failed to see, Officer Whitaker, is that I am not someone you can dismiss." The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed every sound and left only the weight of her words hanging in the air. She straightened, her fingers tapping lightly against the bench, a subtle rhythm that underscored her resolve. "This isn't going away," she said, her voice carrying through the room with quiet finality. "This isn't something you can sweep under the rug or bury in a vague police report. Every person in this room saw what you did. Every reporter back there is already crafting their headlines. Every attorney, every clerk, every officer, they are all witnesses to your abuse of power." Whitaker's breathing grew labored, his face flushing a deep, angry red. But Naomi wasn't done. "There are cameras in this courtroom, officer," she added, her tone rising slightly, each word a nail in the coffin of his defiance. "Every second of what happened here today, every word, every action has been captured. And that footage, it's already being submitted as evidence." The lesson here was stark, undeniable. Justice, when wielded with unwavering resolve, could topple even the most entrenched pillars of power. Whitaker had spent his career believing himself above the law, a king in a kingdom of his own making, but in this moment, that illusion shattered. The consequences of his arrogancy of assuming his authority was absolute had finally caught up to him, and the fallout would echo far beyond the courtroom's walls. For the supporting players, the silent officers, the stunned clerks, the scribbling reporters, this was a reckoning too, a mirror held up to a system that had too often turned a blind eye. And for Naomi, it was a testament to the enduring truth that power, when abused, carries a precision that Whitaker was only beginning to comprehend as the cuffs tightened and the door loomed closer. The air in the courtroom thickened with tension as Officer Daniel Whitaker stood frozen, his muscles coiling tightly beneath his uniform. His sharp, restless eyes flicked toward the far end of the room, where a young court clerk had just risen from his chair. The clerk's hands trembled slightly as he clutched a thick file, his knuckles whitening from the pressure. Whitaker's heartbeat thundered in his ears, a relentless drum roll that drowned out the faint hum of the room. Beside him, Judge Naomi Ellis observed his every twitch with a gaze as steady as stone, her dark eyes piercing through the layers of bravado he'd worn like armor for years. "You assaulted a sitting judge," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness with surgical precision. She paused, letting the accusation hang in the air, heavy and unyielding. On record, in front of multiple sworn legal officials, and that means another deliberate pause, her words sinking into the silence like stones into a still pond. "You have committed a felony." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of sound. Gasps sliced through the air, sharp and involuntary, as whispers slithered between the rows of onlookers like a living thing. A low murmur swelled, a collision of disbelief and dawning realization that crashed against the walls of the once orderly space. Whitaker felt the weight of Naomi's words settle over him like a suffocating fog, draining the color from his face until his skin took on a sickly pallor. His fingers twitched nervously against his thighs, betraying the storm raging within him. Naomi's voice rose again, steady and commanding. "You will be taken into custody, effective immediately." The finality of her tone was a hammer striking an anvil, and Whitaker shot up from his seat as if jolted by electricity, his eyes blazing with a mix of fury and fear. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice reverberating off the wood-paneled walls. Naomi didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on his, unflinching and resolute. "I can," she corrected him, her words calm but laced with steel. "And I am." At that moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the room creaked open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their movements were deliberate, their postures exuding a quiet professionalism that stood in stark contrast to Whitaker's unraveling composure. These weren't ordinary patrol men. They were internal affairs, their badges glinting faintly under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. Whitaker's chest heaved as he turned to face them, his breaths coming in rapid, uneven bursts. "This is," he growled, but the menace in his tone faltered, giving way to a raw, unfamiliar desperation that clawed at his throat. Naomi gave a slight nod toward the officers, her expression unchanging. "Please escort Officer Whitaker into custody." The officers advanced, their polished boots clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that echoed like a metronome of inevitability. Whitaker instinctively shuffled backward, his body tensing as if preparing to bolt. "You're making a mistake," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Naomi tilted her head ever so slightly, a subtle gesture that carried the weight of her certainty. "Oh, I do," she replied, her tone simple yet devastating. "That's exactly why this is happening." The officers closed the distance, their hands clamping onto his arms with a firm, unyielding grip. Whitaker's voice cracked as panic surged through him. "You can't do this. I have rights." Naomi cut him off, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Yes, you do," she said, "and for the first time, you will learn what it means to answer to them." The metallic clink of handcuffs rang out, a sharp, jarring sound that sent a ripple of shock through the room. Whitaker flinched as the cold steel bit into his wrists, his breaths now shallow and ragged. One of the officers began reciting his rights in a flat, procedural tone. "You have the right to remain silent," but Whitaker barely heard the words. His head swiveled toward Naomi, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something deeper, something that teetered on the edge of betrayal. He had spent his career believing power was his birthright, a privilege bestowed upon men like him by a system designed to bend in their favor. But in this moment, as the cuffs tightened and the officer's grips held firm, a bitter truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. Power belonged to those who earned it. And just as true, unrelenting justice had finally tracked him down. The courtroom dissolved into a scene of controlled chaos. What had once been a bastion of rigid procedure and decorum now pulsed with a volatile energy, as if the very walls were straining to contain the magnitude of what had just unfolded. The gallery buzzed with murmurs that refused to die down, shock mingling with whispered theories, and a quiet, simmering satisfaction that tasted like justice too long delayed. Officer Daniel Whitaker, a man who had wielded authority like a blunt instrument, unchecked and unrepentant, now stood shackled. His wrists, once free to command, were bound by the very system he'd assumed would always shield him. Naomi Ellis remained seated behind the bench, her posture as composed as ever, though beneath her steady exterior, a quiet tremor of realization stirred. She had spent years watching men like Whitaker evade accountability, their arrogance bolstered by a network of unspoken alliances and institutional inertia. But today was different. Today, the system had not twisted itself to protect him. The cameras lining the room had captured every second of his fall, their lenses unblinking witnesses to a reckoning he could not escape. Whitaker had ceased struggling, but his body remained rigid, his chest rising and falling in jagged, uneven bursts. His eyes darted wildly across the room, searching desperately for something anything might save him, a sympathetic face, a hidden exit, a legal loophole to unravel the nightmare closing in around him. But there was nothing. The internal affairs officers maintained their iron grip, steering him toward the side exit with a precision that left no room for resistance. The hallways beyond that door, once a stage for his swaggering confidence, now loomed like a narrowing tunnel, their walls pressing in with suffocating inevitability. He twisted his head sharply toward Naomi, his voice raw and ragged. "You think this is over?" He rasped, the remnants of his old entitlement clinging to his words like a fading echo. "You think putting cuffs on me changes anything?" Naomi met his gaze without a flicker of hesitation. "No, Officer Whitaker," she said, her voice as steady as a blade. "The cuffs are just the beginning." His nostrils flared, his entire frame trembling as if the ground beneath him had crumbled away. The unshakable confidence that had once defined him lay in ruins, reduced to ash by the weight of his own actions. "This system, it's always been rigged," he muttered, the words slipping out under his breath, more to himself than to her. "It protects the wrong people." Naomi exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "You and I finally agree on something," she said, her tone carrying a quiet, cutting irony. For the first time, Whitaker had no retort. His mouth parted slightly, as if a response hovered on the tip of his tongue. But whatever defiance he'd clung to withered before it could take shape. The officers tightened their hold, guiding him toward the exit with a firm, unhurried pace. The gallery watched in stunned silence, their eyes tracking his every step. No one leapt to his defense. The colleagues who had once flanked him with nods and knowing grins now sat motionless, their silence a damning testament to the shift in the air. As the doors swung shut behind Whitaker with a heavy, resounding thud, the room seemed to exhale. Though the tension didn't vanish, it transformed, settling into a reflective stillness. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished surface of the bench. She scanned the faces in the room, each one marked by the weight of what they'd just witnessed, a moment so rare, so improbable, that it defied belief. She knew, even before she stepped beyond those walls, that the echoes of this day would ripple far beyond the courthouse, carried on the currents of whispers and headlines. Tapping her fingers once more against the desk, she allowed herself a fleeting moment to absorb it all before refocusing. "We will take a short recess before continuing with today's docket," she announced, her voice as calm and controlled as ever. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck the wood with a crisp, authoritative crack, signaling the session's end, though the reverberations of what had transpired were only beginning. As Naomi rose from her seat and stepped down from the bench, a handful of attorneys approached her, their expressions a kaleidoscope of curiosity, respect, and quiet awe. Among them was an older black attorney, his salt and pepper hair catching the light as he nodded at her in passing. "That," he murmured, his voice low and reverent, "was something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime." Naomi paused, meeting his gaze for a brief moment. "Neither did I," she admitted, her tone soft, but carrying the weight of shared history. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with frenetic energy. Reporters swarmed like bees, their phones and notepads at the ready as they scrambled to piece together the fragments of the year's most explosive legal story. Officers lingered in the halls, exchanging wary glances, some too stunned to speak, others shaking their heads as if trying to dislodge the disbelief lodged in their minds. Whitaker, meanwhile, was already being processed in a holding area, the stark reality of his new existence sinking in with every passing second. His badge had been stripped from him, a small but seismic loss that severed his tether to the identity he'd built. His gun, once an extension of his authority, was gone, and his uniformance a shield no felt like a hollow costume. For the first time in his career, control slipped through his fingers like sand, and the crushing weight of that loss bore down on him with unrelenting force. Back inside the courthouse, Naomi made her way to her chambers, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She slipped inside and closed the door, the faint thud sealing her off from the chaos beyond. For a moment, she stood still, exhaling a slow, steady breath as the adrenaline ebbed away. She had spent years steeling herself against men like Whitaker, refusing to let the system's flaws devour her resolve. But this victory was something she'd never dared imagine witnessing up close. A soft knock broke her reverie, and Carter, the bailiff, stepped inside. His broad frame filled the doorway, his face a mask of careful neutrality. "Judge Ellis," he said, his voice measured, the media's already. She raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "I know," she replied, her tone steady but tinged with fatigue. Carter nodded, lingering for a moment as if weighing whether to say more, then stepped back. Leaving her alone once again, Naomi crossed to her desk, sinking into the chair with a quiet sigh. The lesson of the day pulsed through her thoughts. Justice, when it came, was a slow, relentless force, and the consequences of abusing power could topple even the most entrenched. For Whitaker, the cuffs were only the start, a bitter first taste of a reckoning that would stretch far beyond that courtroom. And for Naomi, it was a reminder that the fight was never truly over, only paused, waiting for the next battle to begin. The clamor outside was relentless, a buzzing hive of voices demanding answers. Naomi let out a long, deliberate exhale, her breath fogging briefly in the cool air of her chambers. She gave a small, resigned nod, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Of course they do," she murmured under her breath, the weight of inevitability settling over her like a heavy cloak. Carter, her steadfast aide, stood across from her, his broad shoulders stiff with hesitation. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his fingers twitching at his sides as if unsure whether to stay or flee. After a beat, he cleared his throat, his voice low and cautious. "I got a call from the chief of police's office earlier. They're asking for a meeting about Whitaker's case." Naomi's dark eyes flicked up to meet his, unflinching, unsurprised. The news landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through her thoughts, though her face remained a mask of calm resolve. "Tell them I'll be free after the afternoon session," she replied, her tone steady, betraying none of the storm brewing within her. Carter dipped his head in acknowledgement, but he didn't leave right away. He lingered, his boots scuffing faintly against the hardwood floor, his brow creased with something unspoken. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost reluctant. "You know they're going to push back hard on this, right?" Her gaze locked onto his, sharp and unyielding, a silent challenge shimmering in her eyes. "They can try," she said simply, her words carrying the quiet force of a judge's gavel striking wood. Carter let out a breath he'd been holding, a faint puff of air that seemed to carry his doubts with it. He gave her a small, tight smile, half encouragement, half worry, before muttering, "Good luck out there," and stepping back into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Naomi alone in the stillness of her office. She stood motionless for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her desk, her fingers tracing the worn grain of the wood. It was a fleeting pause, a stolen breath before the chaos she knew awaited her beyond those walls. This wasn't the end, she thought, her chest tightening with resolve. It was merely the opening chapter. The courthouse corridors thrummed with a restless energy, a palpable tension that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Every murmured conversation crackled with the weight of what had unfolded earlier that day, each word laced with whispers of disbelief, intrigue, and something darker, something unsettled. As Naomi stepped into the hallway, the polished marble floor gleamed beneath her heels, reflecting the dim glow of the overhead lights. The sharp, rhythmic click of her footsteps echoed through the space, cutting through the low hum of voices like a blade. Eyes followed her, some wide with awe, others narrowed with suspicion, a few glinting with quiet fear. She felt their stares pressing against her, a thousand invisible hands tugging at her resolve, testing her strength. The weight of their expectations clashed with the reality of what she'd just done. Daniel Whitaker, once a towering figure of authority, was no longer Officer Allman. He was a number now, a name on a processing sheet. Stripped of his badge and bound by the same laws he'd once wielded like a weapon, she moved with purpose, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared against the invisible tide threatening to pull her under. The double doors loomed ahead, their brass handles catching the light as she approached. With a firm push, she stepped outside, and the world erupted around her. A barrage of flashing lights assaulted her vision, cameras clicking and whirring like a swarm of restless insects. Microphones thrust toward her, voices shouting over one another in a chaotic symphony of demands. Judge Ellis, what's your statement on Officer Whitaker's arrest? Do you think this sets a precedent for police accountability? Are you afraid of backlash from the force? The questions came fast and furious, a deluge she stood against like a rock in a raging river. Naomi didn't flinch. She planted her feet firmly on the courthouse steps, her dark coat billowing slightly in the late afternoon breeze. She let the noise wash over her, her expression serene yet steely. A woman who had faced storms before and emerged unbroken. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the air cool against her lips, then spoke. Her voice cut through the din, clear and unwavering, each syllable weighted with conviction. Justice doesn't play favorites. It doesn't bend to shield one person while shattering another. What happened in my courtroom today wasn't a performance or a vendetta, it was the law at work. The same law that applies to every soul in this nation, no matter the uniform they wear or the title they carry. The reporters surged forward, their voices rising again, hungry for more, desperate to peel back the layers of her words. But Naomi refused to be drawn into their game. This isn't about politics or personal scores, she continued, her tone firm, unyielding. It's about accountability, pure and simple. I stand by every ruling made in that courtroom, and I always will. With that, she turned, her heels striking the stone steps with quiet finality as she walked away, leaving the press grasping at the echoes of her statement. The cameras flashed wildly behind her, but she didn't look back. She'd given them the truth, let them wrestle with its weight. Inside the precinct, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the tang of metal and despair. Daniel Whitaker sat hunched in a cramped holding cell, the cold gray walls closing in around him like a vice. His hands were balled into fists, the knuckles white, veins bulging beneath his skin as if they might burst. His jaw clenched so tightly he could feel the ache radiating up to his temples, a dull throb that matched the hammering of his pulse. He stared at the bars in front of him, his eyes burning with a mix of rage and disbelief, refusing to blink as if doing so might make this nightmare real. This couldn't be happening yet to him. He'd seen men in these cells before, had shoved them behind these same bars with a smirk and a swagger, certain of his place above them. He knew the system, understood its gears and levers, had worked them to his advantage for years. And yet, here he was, trapped in its jaws, the rules he'd mastered suddenly rewritten. His breath came in uneven bursts, shallow and ragged, his chest heaving as panic clawed at his insides. He'd always believed himself untouchable, the badge on his chest a shield against the consequences that snared lesser men. But now, as the cold steel of the bench pressed into his spine, a sickening realization settled over him. No one was coming to pull him out of this. His colleaguestos, same men who'd slapped his back in the break room, Hood chuckled at his bravado and nodded along to his rants. About cleaning up the streets were silent. No calls, no visits, no whispered assurances of support. The silence was deafening, suffocating, a void that swallowed his last threads of hope. Footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy and deliberate, each one a hammer strike against the fragile shell of his denial. Whitaker's head snapped up as Chief Warren appeared before the bars, his broad frame filling the narrow space. The chief's face was a mask, unreadable. His arms crossed tightly over his chest. There was no warmth in his eyes, no flicker of the camaraderie they'd once shared, just a cold, simmering disgust that made Whitaker's stomach twist. "Do you even realize the mess you've made?" Warren's voice was low and sharp, slicing through the silence like a shard of glass. Whitaker's nostrils flared, his breath hissing out as he shot back, "I was doing my damn job." The words burst from him, raw and defiant, but they rang hollow even to his own ears. Warren's response was a slow, measured exhale, his head shaking faintly as if he pitied the man before him. "Your job," he repeated, his tone laced with incredulity. "Do you have any idea what's happening out there? You didn't just dig your own grave. Whitaker, you dragged the rest of us down with you." Whitaker surged to his feet, his body coiled with tension, his hands trembling at his sides. "What do you want from me?" he spat, his voice rising. "You want me to say I'm sorry, that I'd take it back?" A harsh, bitter laugh escaped him, echoing off the cell walls. "I did what any of us would have done. And now, because some judge in a robe doesn't like it, I'm the one locked up." Warren's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You still don't get it, do you? That judge in a robe is the law. You assaulted her authority, and you did it on camera. You handed them a smoking gun, Whitaker, and now they've got all the proof they need to tear you apart." The words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of Whitaker's crumbling bravado. His throat tightened, the air suddenly too thick to swallow, as Warren leaned closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "The department's not standing by you. The union's not stepping in. Even the guys who used to have your back, they are keeping their distance. You're on your own." Whitaker's jaw locked, his teeth grinding together, but he couldn't argue with the truth staring him down. Warren straightened, his gaze unrelenting. "You'll be charged, you'll face trial, and if you're lucky, losing your badge will be the least of your worries." He turned to leave, pausing only to toss one final piece of advice over his shoulder, his voice hollow and tired. "Start thinking about what kind of deal you'll take, because this isn't going away." The cell door clanged shut behind him, the sound reverberating through Whitaker's skull as he sank back onto the bench. His hands rose to his face, fingers digging into his scalp, and for the first time, the weight of his new reality crashed over him. He wasn't the hunter anymore, he was the hunted. Back at the courthouse, Naomi sat alone in her chambers, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden streaks across the room. She gazed out the window, her hands folded in her lap, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Exhaustion tugged at her bones, a deep, aching weariness that seeped into every muscle. But her mind refused to rest. She knew what lay ahead, the appeals, the media circus, the veiled threats from those who would rather see Whitaker walk free than face justice. There would be accusations, claims that she'd overreached, that she'd let bias cloud her judgment. She'd seen it all before, had watched as people twisted the truth to fit their own narratives, to shield their own comfort. But today was different. Today, the scales had tipped, and she'd felt the shift in her core. She closed her eyes, letting the stillness wrap around her, her breath slow and steady as she exhaled the day's burdens. Whitaker's fall wasn't just a single man's reckoning, it was a lesson, a crack in the facade of unchecked power. Justice, she thought, was a relentless force, one that demanded accountability even when the world resisted. When she opened her eyes again, the resolve was still there, burning quietly in her chest. The fight was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next. Outside, the city pulsed on, its rhythm unbroken by the drama unfolding within the courthouse walls. But inside, the air remained charged, thick with the aftermath of a day that had rewritten the rules. In every office, every hallway, voices hushed but urgent carried the story forward. Clerks and aides exchanged glances. their words tumbling over one another as they recounted the scene in the courtroom. How Whitaker's arrogance had crumbled, how Judge Ellis had stood unmoved, her rulings a beacon of unflinching justice. Some spoke with a quiet satisfaction, a sense that a long overdue balance had been struck. Others whispered with unease, their eyes darting toward the exits as if expecting retribution to storm through the doors. Among them was Carter, leaning against a filing cabinet, his arms crossed as he listened to a junior clerk recount the press conference. The young man's hands gestured wildly, his voice rising with excitement as he mimicked Naomi's steady cadence. She just stood there like nothing could touch her, he said, awe-threading through his words. Carter nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He'd seen her strength before, had watched her weather storms that would have broken lesser souls. But today had been something else, something seismic. He pushed off the cabinet, clapping the clerk on the shoulder. "She's not done yet," he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that silenced the room. Not by a long shot. The lesson was clear, woven into every moment of that day. Power, when abused, carried a price. Justice wasn't a gift to be granted or withheld. It was a force, impartial and unrelenting, that held even the mighty accountable. For Whitaker, it was a fall from grace that shattered his illusions. For Naomi, it was a stand that deepened her purpose. And for the city watching, it was a warning, a reminder that no one stood above the law, and that its consequences, once set in motion, could not be undone. In the dim light of her chambers, Naomi Ellis sat behind her imposing oak desk, her hands clasped tightly together as if anchoring herself to the moment. Her face, a carefully crafted mask of composure, betrayed none of the turmoil roiling beneath. Inside, her mind churned like a tempest, thoughts crashing into one another with relentless force. Exhaustion pressed against her temples, a heavy fog that had crept in once the adrenaline of the courtroom faded. That rush had propelled her through the day's battle, but now, in the stillness, it abandoned her, leaving behind a weight far more perilous than fatigue. This was the unspoken aftermath part no one warned you about, the part no mentor could prepare you for. It wasn't the bold stand she'd taken, the decision that had reverberated through the halls of justice. No, it was this, the suffocating silence that followed, the crushing burden that draped itself over her shoulders once the gavel fell, and the audience dispersed, leaving her alone with the echoes of her choices. Beyond the thick wooden door, she could hear them, soft murmurs, hesitant footsteps, the faint rustle of fabric as people lingered just outside. Their voices were hushed, barely audible, but thick with anticipation. They were watching her, waiting to see what she'd do next. She'd made a choice today, one that had fractured something fundamental, and they all felt it. There was no retreating from this precipice, no way to unmake the moment or scrub it from existence. Naomi had known this day would come, had braced herself for it. True power, she understood, was never free. It demanded a toll, one she'd always been willing to pay. Yet knowing didn't soften the reality of it pressing against her now. A sharp rap at the door jolted her upright, the sound slicing through the quiet like a blade. It was deliberate, insistent, a summons she couldn't ignore. "Come in," she called, her voice a steady thread of steel, betraying none of the storm within. The door creaked open, and Carter stepped into the room, his broad frame filling the threshold. His face was taut, his shoulders rigid as though he carried an invisible burden. He paused for a heartbeat, his hand resting on the knob, then shut the door with a soft click, sealing them into the stillness. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the lines of her face as if searching for cracks in her armor. He'd known her for years, had stood by her side through countless battles, and could read the subtle shifts others missed. "You all right?" he asked at last, his voice quieter than she'd expected, laced with a rare gentleness. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the desk's polished surface. "I should be," she admitted, her tone measured but honest. "But I'm not." Carter nodded, a slow dip of his head as if her words confirmed something he'd already sensed. He pulled out the chair across from her with a scrape, settling into it heavily. Rubbing his hands together, he hesitated before speaking again. "Because you know this isn't over," he said, his gaze locking with hers. Naomi met his eyes, her lips thinning into a tight line. "No," she agreed, her voice low but resolute. It's just beginning. Carter let out a long breath, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge the weight of it all. Whitaker's in deep, he said, leaning forward slightly, words spreading his still talking, still flapping his gums like he thinks this is some mix-up that'll blow over. If he waits long enough, he doesn't get it. He doesn't see what's coming. Naomi wasn't surprised. Men like Daniel Whitaker didn't simply wake up one morning and confront their own failings. That wasn't how their minds worked. They resisted, they deflected, they built fortresses of denial around themselves. Even when the walls crumbled, they'd cling to the delusion that they were the wronged ones, the true casualties of an unjust world. Justice to them was a concept they wielded, not one they bowed to. But Carter wasn't done. He hesitated, his jaw tightening, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There's more. Chief Warren swung by earlier. He's rattled, and not just about Whitaker, it's the department. He's worried about how far this rot spreads. Naomi's stomach twisted, a cold knot forming deep inside, but she kept her expression smooth, unreadable. What do you mean? She pressed, though a part of her already knew. Carter glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst through, then fixed his eyes back on her. Word is, internal affairs isn't stopping at Whitaker. They're widening the net, digging into his whole precinct. Years of misconduct complaints, cases that got buried, evidence that vanished into thin air. They're pulling it all apart. A shiver of dread snaked up Naomi's spine, slow and deliberate, chilling her to the core. She'd always suspected Whitaker wasn't an anomaly. She'd felt it in her bones every time she'd pored over reports that didn't align. Every time she'd watched justice slip away before it could even take root. She'd known the corruption wasn't confined to one man, but Afia was already unraveling the threads. This wasn't just a fracture anymore, it was a reckoning. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself against the rising tide. Good, she said simply, her voice firm. Carter watched her, his brow furrowing. You say that now, but this is gonna get messy fast. Naomi tilted her head, a faint flicker of defiance in her eyes. It was already messy. She replied, we just stopped turning a blind eye. Carter dragged a hand down his face, exhaling a weary sigh. You know what's coming, don't you? The department, the unions. The big shots are not gonna take this lying down. They'll fight back. They'll make it a war. They'll come for you, Naomi, every angle, every chance they get. Some'll make it personal. A small, bitter smile tugged at her lips. It's always personal, she said, her tone dry but edged with truth. For them, for me. The only difference now is it's out in the open. Carter muttered something under his breath, half a curse, half a prayer before leaning back in his chair. Damn, he said, louder this time. I hope you're ready for what's next. Before she could answer, another knock shattered the stillness. Sharper and more frantic than before, Naomi exchanged a quick glance with Carter, her pulse quickening. Come in, she called, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. The door swung open, and a young court clerk stumbled inside, her face drained of color, her hands clutching a manila folder so tightly her knuckles gleamed white. Judge Ellis, she said, her voice trembling with urgency, you need to see this. Naomi took the folder, her fingers brushing the clerk's shaking ones. As she flipped it open, her breath caught in her throat. Page after page stared back at her police reports, each bearing the insignia of Whitaker's precinct. The dates stretched back over a decade. A grim timeline of misconduct complaints swept under the rug. Testimonies from citizens silenced before they could be heard. Patterns of abuse so blatant they screamed from the paper. And there, woven through it all, was Daniel Whitaker's name, a thread tying the chaos together. Her grip tightened, the edges of the folder creasing under her fingers. This wasn't just one man's since it was a machine, a system built to protect itself, layer upon layer of complicity. And now, it was coming apart at the seams. Carter leaned over her shoulder, skimming the pages, his face darkened, a shadow passing over his features. Jesus, he muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. This is systemic. Naomi closed the folder with a soft thud, her mind already racing ahead. Exactly, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. This wasn't just about dragging Whitaker into the light, it was about every officer who'd turned a blind eye, every superior who'd signed off on the cover-ups, every official who'd let the rot fester. And now, she held the evidence in her hands. Carter exhaled slowly, his eyes searching hers. So what now? Naomi met his gaze, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. Now, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, her eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be dimmed, we burn it all down. The city felt the shift like a storm that wouldn't break, its tension hanging thick in the air. Whispers rippled through crowded streets, news broadcasts crackled with updates, and wary eyes followed every move. For too long, the system had shielded its own, but now it had no choice. It had held one of its guardians accountable. The courthouse, once just stone and glass, had become a crucible, the heart of something vast and unstoppable. What began with a single act of arrogancia slap echoing through a courtroom had spiraled into a reckoning. Names surfaced like ghosts from the shadows, officers faced scrutiny, and policies that had stood unchallenged for decades teetered on the brink of collapse. At the center stood Naomi Ellis, the spark that had ignited the blaze. For weeks, she'd weathered the storm. Threats hissed through phone lines, the smears splashed across headlines, the calculated efforts to paint her as a zealot, a radical tearing at the fabric of order. They'd tried to recast Whitaker as a martyr, a good man ensnared by politics, but the truth was too loud, too ugly to silence. Naomi had known the cost of wielding justice against those who abused power, had felt its lessons etched into her soul. Every misstep they took to bury it only deepened the wound, exposing the consequences of their arrogance. And as the city watched, breathless and divided, she stood firm, ready to see it through, to ensure that the fall of one would topple the many, and that the light of accountability would leave no corner untouched. The city buzzed with a restless energy on that fateful day, a hum that vibrated through the crowded streets and seeped into the towering courthouse, where Daniel Whitaker's fate hung in the balance. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of expectation and the sharp tang of sweat from a throng of onlookers. Packed shoulder to shoulder, rows of wooden benches groaned under the strain of journalists scribbling furiously, citizens clutching crumpled tissues, and former colleagues shifting uncomfortably in their crisp uniforms. The ceiling loomed high above, its ornate carvings casting jagged shadows that seemed to claw at the walls, mirroring the tension below. Whitaker sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders hunched inward, a far cry from the towering figure who once strode through precinct halls with an untouchable swagger. His navy suit, once a symbol of authority, now hung loosely on his frame, wrinkled and dulled by days of unrelenting scrutiny. His fingers gripped the armrests of his chair, the knuckles blanching white as if clinging to the last vestiges of a power that had slipped through his grasp like sand. Years of arrogance had fueled him, years of bending the truth, erasing evidence with a flick of his wrist, rewriting reports to paint himself as the hero. He'd silenced videos that dared to capture his brutality, believing the world would bend to his will. But the truth, once glimpsed, was a wildfire that could not be extinguished. It had roared through the city, fueled by the voices of those he'd crushed under his heel, ordinary people who'd trembled at his name, officers who'd looked away, and a judge who'd nearly paid the ultimate price for crossing him. The trial had barreled forward with a speed that left even the most seasoned observers reeling. His legal team, a flurry of expensive suits and furrowed brows, had scrambled to cobble together a defense, tossing out plea deals like lifelines in a storm. But Naomi, standing resolute behind the bench, had refused to let the tide turn in his favor. To her, justice wasn't a bargaining chip, it was a blade, sharp and unyielding, meant to carve out the rot that men like Whitaker had let fester. As she read the final verdict, her voice cut through the room like a bell tolling in a storm. "Officer Daniel Whitaker," she began, her tone steady as granite, her dark eyes locked on his hollowed face. "You have been found guilty on multiple counts: excessive force that shattered lives, obstruction of justice that buried the truth, falsification of reports that twisted reality, and the assault of a sitting judge who dared to uphold the law." She paused, letting the words settle, watching as they sank into him like stones into a still pond. "This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8. The room erupted a shockwave of gasps, Stifled sobs and murmurs rippling through the crowd. Whitaker didn't flinch. His face remained a blank mask. But beneath the surface, something fractured. His hands tightened on the chair. A silent scream of a man who'd finally glimpsed the abyss he'd dug for himself. The officers who approached him were ghosts of his past men, who'd once laughed at his jokes, who'd ignored the blood on his hands. Now, their faces were grim, their movements mechanical as they snapped the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The clink echoed in the silence, a sound that carried him out of the courtroom, past the blinding flashes of cameras, past the journalists shouting questions, past the crowd that had once cowered and now stood tall. Naomi stepped down from the bench, her breath escaping in a slow, deliberate exhale. The gavel's echo still lingered in her ears, a punctuation mark on a battle she'd fought with every fiber of her being. Her dark robe swished softly against the polished floor as she moved, the weight of it a reminder of the responsibility she carried. She'd watch Whitaker unravel, seeing the man who'd once loomed over her precinct like a storm cloud reduced to a shadow. But as she left the courtroom, she felt no triumphantly a quiet resolve. This wasn't the end. Whitaker's fall had ripped open a wound in the precinct, exposing a tangle of corruption that stretched back years. Officers resigned in droves, their badges tarnished by association. Others faced arrests, their pleas drowned out by the evidence piling up like debris after a flood. The leadership crumbled, replaced by fresh faces untainted by the old ways. Policies that had shielded men like Whitaker were torn apart, rewritten with ink still wet from the hands of those who'd demanded change. For the first time, Naomi saw the law bend toward something greater, not just punishment, but accountability. A lesson carved deep into the city's bones. Power abused would meet its reckoning. The courthouse halls stretched long and quiet as she walked, the marble cool beneath her feet. Faces turned toward her clerks with tired eyes, lawyers with briefcases clutched tight, citizens who'd lingered to catch a glimpse of the woman who'd toppled a giant. A young officer, barely out of the academy, gave her a hesitant nod, his expression a mix of awe and uncertainty. An older woman, her hands weathered from years of toil, whispered a shaky thank you as she passed. Naomi met each gaze with a steady one of her own, feeling the weight of their hope, their exhaustion, their fragile trust. She'd done what others had faltered at, stood firm where they'd buckled, but she knew this was only a spark in a long, smoldering fight. Justice wasn't a single verdict scratched onto paper. It was a river, ceaseless and relentless, carving its path through stone. Every ruling, every law, every choice she made rippled outward, touching lives she'd never see. The thought settled in her chest, heavy but warm, as she pushed through the courthouse doors into the fading light of dusk. Outside, the city sprawled before her, its skyline jagged against a sky streaked with gold and gray. A small crowd lingered on the steps, reporters packing up their gear, families clutching signs that read "Justice Served." Carter appeared at her side, his lanky frame slouched slightly, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His tie was loosened, his face softer than it had been in weeks, the lines of tension smoothed by the day's end. "Hell of a day," he muttered, his voice rough around the edges, his hazel eyes flicking toward her. Naomi let out a breath, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she leaned against the stone railing. "Hell of a fight," she corrected, her tone carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every doubt she'd pushed aside. Carter's smirk widened, a spark of his usual mischief breaking through. "Think you made history today, Judge?" She turned her gaze to the city, to the people milling below, their faces alight with something she hadn't seen in yearship, raw and unpolished. "No," she said softly, her voice barely above the wind. "I think we just finally caught up to it." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that broke the stillness. "Guess you're right." His tone shifted, grew heavier as he faced her fully. "You did something real today, Naomi. Something they're gonna carry with them." She met his eyes, seeing the sincerity beneath his usual bravado. Carter wasn't one for grand words, was a man of action, a steady presence who'd stood by her through the chaos, filing reports, chasing leads, keeping her grounded when the storm raged fiercest. "That's the thing about justice," she said, her voice firm yet tinged with something softer. "When it's real, it doesn't need statues or headlines. It just needs to sink in, to be felt in the quiet moments. He nodded slowly, letting her words hang between them, their truth settling like dust after a long day. With a gentle pat on her shoulder, he turned and ambled down the steps, his silhouette blending into the twilight crowd. Naomi stayed where she was, the cool air brushing her face as she watched the world shift forward. The city exhaled a collective release of years of fear, of silence. The work wasn't done yet, never would debut tonight. Justice had claimed a victory, and that was enough to carry her into the next fight. Across town, another story unfolded, one that would soon weave into the tapestry of this shifting world. The Johnson family had arrived at the bustling international airport, their suitcases rattling over the tiled floor, their voices bright with anticipation. Mike, a seasoned FBI agent with a jaw carved from years of grit and a heart softened by his love for his family, led the way. His broad frame moved with purpose, one hand pulling a suitcase, the other clasped around little Ava's tiny fingers. At 8, she was the spark of the group, her wide eyes gleaming with wonder, her laughter a melody that danced through the chaos of the terminal. Beside him, Emma, a lawyer whose fierce spirit had toppled countless injustices, walked with a rare lightness. Her dark hair was swept back, her smile warm as she watched their four daughters chatter about the seaside resort awaiting them. Sophie, 14 and steady as a lighthouse, kept a watchful eye on her siblings, her calm demeanor a mirror of her father's. Lily, 12 and bold, strode ahead, her voice cutting through the din as she declared her plans to surf every wave. Chloe, 10 and tender-hearted, clung to Emma's hand, her sensitive soul already soaking in the excitement and the faint hum of unease she couldn't yet name. For once, Mike and Emma felt unburdened. No cases, no courtrooms, just the promise of sun-soaked days with the girls they'd fought so hard to protect. The airport thrummed with life travelers rushing past, announcements crackling overhead, the scent of coffee wafting from a small cafe where chocolate-dipped donuts gleamed in the display. "Look, girls," Emma said, pointing with a grin, "if we get through security fast, those treats are ours." The girls squealed, their energy infectious, and Mike chuckled, a rare sound that loosened the knot of stress he'd carried for months. "All right, let's move," he said, guiding them toward the checkpoint, his hand brushing Emma's in a quiet moment of connection. They shared a glance, a silent vow that this trip would be their sanctuary from the battles they fought daily. But as they approached the security line, the air shifted. The officers' casual glances hardened into something colder, their eyes narrowing as they swept over the family. Mike felt at first a prickle at the back of his neck, honed from years in the field. Emma sensed it too, her lawyer's instincts kicking in as she tightened her grip on Chloe's hand. To these strangers in uniform, they weren't a family on vacation, they were a threat, a puzzle that didn't fit their preconceived mold. The screening area was a stark contrast to the terminal's bustle style, quiet, the hum of machines underscoring a growing tension. A stern officer stepped forward, his face a mask of suspicion, his gaze lingering on the girls before settling on Mike. "Step aside," he barked, his voice clipped and cold. Mike stood tall, his composure unshaken, though his heart thudded with a fury he kept buried. He was used to staring down danger, but this was different. His daughters stood behind him, their excitement fading into confusion. Sophie frowned, her sharp mind piecing together the shift. Lily's chin jutted out, defiance flaring in her eyes. Chloe's lip trembled, her small frame pressing closer to Emma. Ava, still clutching Mike's hand, looked up with a question she couldn't voice. The officer's interrogation began sharp, accusatory, each word a jab meant to unravel them. Emma's voice rose in protest, steady and cutting, but the officer waved her off. His focus locked on Mike. Detained in front of his family, Mike's mind raced not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of who he was, an FBI agent, a protector, a man who'd spent his life upholding the law these officers now twisted. The truth would come out, and when it did, the consequences would ripple far beyond this checkpoint. A stark reminder that justice, when provoked, spares no one. The air in the bustling airport terminal felt thick and stifling as Mike Johnson stood at the center of his family, clutching his wife Emma's hand with a grip that betrayed his outward calm. His youngest daughter, Chloe, pressed herself closer to him, her small fingers trembling as they intertwined with his. Her wide, uncertain eyes flickered up toward her father, searching for some sign of reassurance amidst the growing unease. Beside her, little Ava tugged insistently at Emma's shirt, her tiny hands pulling at the fabric as if it were a lifeline. The worry etched across Ava's face was unmistakable, her brows furrowed, her lips quivering slightly as she glanced around at the unfamiliar chaos of uniforms and stern faces. Emma, sensing the mounting fear in her children, knelt down to Ava's level, her knees pressing into the cold, polished floor. She offered a gentle smile, one crafted with care to mask the tension coiling tightly in her chest. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft but strained, as though each word required effort to keep steady. Nearby, a security officer stood with a clipboard in hand, his movements methodical and deliberate as he scrutinized the family's documents. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through the pages of their passports, pausing occasionally to cast a glance at Mike. The officer's face remained impassive, but there was a hardness in his stare that made Mike's stomach twist. Reaching into his jacket, Mike pulled out their passports and, with a measured breath, slid his FBI credentials across the counter. "I'm an FBI agent," he said, his voice steady and resonant, cutting through the hum of the terminal. "My family and I are just here for a vacation." He intended the statement to clarify, to smooth over any misunderstanding, but the officer's gaze only sharpened, a flicker of skepticism flashing across his features. He picked up Mike's badge, holding it up to the light as if it might reveal some hidden flaw, then looked back at Mike with a sneer that barely concealed his disdain. Emma caught the shift in the officer's demeanor, and a spark of indignation flared within her. Her jaw tightened, but she bit back the sharp words rising in her throat. She knew losing her temper wouldn't help, not here, not now, with her daughters watching. Instead, she focused on Lily, her 12-year-old, who stood a few steps away, her brow creased with confusion. "Mom," Lily whispered, her voice small but edged with curiosity. "Why's he looking at Dad like that?" Emma bent down again, her knees aching from the hard floor, and took Lily's hand in hers. "It's fine, sweetie," she replied, her tone low and soothing. "It's just a routine check." But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Deep inside, a gnawing dread began to take root, curling around her heart like a shadow she couldn't shake. The officer finished his inspection of their documents, but made no move to wave them through. Instead, he turned his head slightly, signaling to a colleague with a curt nod. Another officer approached, his strides purposeful, his expression darkening as he joined the first. The two exchanged hushed words, their voices too low for Mike to catch, but the way their eyes darted toward his family sent a chill down his spine. Mike stood taller, forcing his shoulders back, though frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. He could feel the weight of their suspicion pressing down on him, as if he and his loved ones were no longer travelers, but threats to be dissected and judged. The second officer stepped forward, his demeanor colder than the first, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "Johnson family," he said, his tone carrying an edge of command. "We need you to step into a separate room for further verification." Mike's breath caught at the unexpected demand. "What more do you need?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled, each word measured to keep his rising anger in check. "I've given you everything: passports, my credentials. We've cooperated fully." The officer shrugged, his indifference cutting deeper than any explanation could. "Standard procedure," he replied flatly. "Please cooperate." Emma's eyes flashed with recognition. This wasn't procedure. It was prejudice masquerading as protocol. She saw the injustice plain as day, but for her daughter's sake, she swallowed her outrage. Reaching out, she placed a steadying hand on Mike's shoulder, her touch a silent plea to keep his composure. He met her gaze, and in that fleeting exchange, they shared a quiet understanding. Something was unraveling here, something far beyond a simple security check. As they were ushered toward the private screening room, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Chloe's grip on Emma's hand tightened, her voice trembling as she looked up with wide, fearful eyes. "Mom, did we do something wrong?" she asked, her innocence piercing Emma's heart like a shard of glass. Emma knelt once more, brushing a strand of hair from Chloe's face. her fingers lingering as she forced a smile. "No, honey," she said softly, "it's just a check. We're okay." But the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. She knew this wasn't right. Their family was being singled out, targeted for reasons she couldn't yet fathom. Inside the small, sterile room, the officers began their relentless inspection. They rifled through the family's luggage with mechanical precision, pulling out clothes, books, and toys with gloved hands. Every item was held up, examined, and set aside under the weight of their probing stares. The tension wrapped around Mike like a vice, his chest tightening as he watched his daughter's growing distress. Ava clung to Emma's side, her small frame trembling, while Chloe's eyes darted nervously around the room. Sophie, the eldest at 15, stood with her arms crossed, trying to project strength, but her gaze kept flickering toward her mother, silently pleading for an end to this ordeal. Lily, meanwhile, observed the officers with a spark of defiance in her eyes. She scanned their movements, noting the way they lingered over her father's belongings, and a realization began to dawn on her: this wasn't random. It was deliberate, excessive, a power play cloaked as duty. Mike's anger churned hotter with every passing minute. He knew his family was innocent, yet here they were, treated like criminals under the watchful eyes of his children. The responsibility to shield them from this injustice bore down on him, a weight heavier than any case he'd handled in his career. He glanced at Emma, her face a mirror of his own frustration and fear, and they both understood that this might not resolve as quickly as they'd hoped. A young officer, his face sharp and unyielding, stepped closer, his gaze raking over each family member with a cold intensity that sent a shiver through Emma. She recognized that look. It wasn't the routine caution of a security check, but a judgment, a presumption of guilt that had no basis in reality. "We've given you everything," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fury building within her. "Passports, credentials, all of it. I don't understand why you're treating us like this." The officer offered no response, just a dismissive shrug as he continued his scrutiny. Lily, sensing the wrongness of it all, leaned closer to her mother. "Mom," she whispered, her voice quivering with unease, "why are they doing this to us?" Sophie reached out, resting a hand on her younger sister's shoulder, her own emotions a tangled mix of anger and helplessness. She wanted to comfort Lily, to tell her it would be okay, but the words wouldn't come in it when she felt the same creeping doubt. After what felt like an eternity, Mike spoke again, his tone sharp but controlled. "Can you at least tell us why this is taking so long?" The young officer turned to him, his expression icy. "We have to ensure passenger safety," he said, his words clipped and vague. "Recent incidents mean we're being extra cautious." The answer rang hollow, a flimsy excuse that only fueled Mike and Emma's frustration. They exchanged a look, Emma's eyes blazing with determination. This wasn't the first time they'd faced unfair treatment, but to have it happen now, on a vacation meant to bring their family joy, cut deeper than ever. The officer's silent message was clear: the Johnsons didn't belong here, not among the other passengers who passed through without a second glance. The ordeal stretched on as another officer arrived, his presence adding to the suffocating tension. He rechecked their documents with the same meticulous suspicion, then stepped aside to make a call, his voice a low murmur as he verified their identities. Soon, the questions grew more invasive, probing not just Mike's background but the lives of each family member. "Where were you last week? Who do you know in this area?" The inquiries felt like accusations, each one chipping away at their dignity. Mike's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm, his daughter's anxious faces anchoring him. Emma leaned close, her breath warm against his ear. "Do you think they'll let us go?" she whispered, her voice trembling with worry. "The kids are scared." Mike met her gaze, his eyes burning with suppressed rage. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have to stay calm for them." Sophie's voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant. "Mom, did we do something wrong? Why are they keeping us so long?" Emma turned to her, stroking her hair with a tenderness that belied her own turmoil. "There's nothing wrong, honey," she said, forcing a smile. "We'll be out soon, I promise." But the promise felt fragile, a thread stretched thin by the reality unfolding around them. Emma had spent years advocating for others caught in unjust situations. Yet now she stood powerless as her own family became victims of baseless scrutiny. Finally, after another agonizing wait, an officer returned, his face unreadable. Instead of releasing them, he pointed toward a different door. "You'll need to wait in another lounge area until we finish verification," he said. His tone flat and unapologetic. Emma's patience snapped. "This is a passenger area," she said, her voice calm but laced with indignation. "Why are we being moved again? We've done nothing to deserve this." The officer avoided her gaze, offering no answer. And Mike squeezed her hand, a silent signal to hold back for the sake of their children. As they gathered their belongings and moved to the new waiting area, the girls trailed behind, their innocence now shadowed by confusion and fear. Sophie and Lily exchanged worried glances, their understanding of the situation deepening, while Chloe and Ava stayed close to Emma, their small hands clutching hers as if she alone could shield them from the unknown. The new lounge was stark and unwelcoming, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the room. Two airport police officers approached, their faces stern and their eyes sharp with scrutiny. The first, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, fixed Mike with a piercing stare. "I need to see your identification again," he demanded, his voice gruff and impatient. "All of you this time." Mike's jaw tightened, but he complied, handing over his FBI badge and their passports once more. "We're just on vacation," he said, his tone clipped but clear. "I'm an FBI agent. Me family's done nothing wrong." The officer barely glanced at the badge, passing it to his younger partner, who smirked with open disrespect. Emma's resolve faltered, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "We've followed every rule, answered every question," she said, her words firm and unwavering. "Why are you holding us back like this?" The officers offered no explanation, their silence a stark reminder of the power they wielded and the consequences of its misuse. As the Johnson family sat in the suffocating stillness, the lesson sank in. Justice was not always blind, and those entrusted with authority could twist it to their own ends. For Mike and Emma, the fight to protect their children from this ordeal became a testament to resilience, a quiet stand against a system that saw them not as people, but as suspects. And for their daughters, the memory of this day would linger, a bitter introduction to a world where fairness could be overshadowed by the whims of those in control. The air hung thick with tension as the young officer stood before the Johnson family, his voice slicing through the quiet bustle of the airport like a dull blade. "It's our protocol, ma'am," he said, his tone icy and devoid of warmth, as if the words themselves were a wall he hid behind. "So, you'll need to cooperate." He offered no explanation, no hint of empathy, just a curt dismissal that landed heavily on Emma's ears. She stood there, her brow furrowing with frustration, feeling the weight of his indifference settle into her chest. Her daughters, Sophie and Lily, lingered close by, their sharp eyes catching the flicker of irritation on their mother's face. They exchanged a quick glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Meanwhile, the younger girls, Chloe and Ava, pressed themselves tighter against Emma's sides, their small hands clutching at her clothes. Confusion clouded their wide eyes, and a tremor of fear ran through their tiny frames, unspoken but palpable. Mike, standing tall beside his wife, felt a sting of personal offense coil in his gut. The officer's flippant attitude gnawed at him, but he forced his voice to remain steady, a calm anchor amidst the rising storm. "You say it's protocol," he began, locking eyes with the young man, his gaze unwavering and piercing. "But is this protocol applied to everyone or just us?" His question cut through the air, sharp yet measured, carrying the weight of a man who refused to be brushed aside. He waited, hoping for a shred of reason, a crack in the officer's cold facade. But the young man merely shrugged, his shoulders lifting with an unapologetic laziness that only fueled Mike's simmering anger. "If you've got an issue with our protocol, feel free to file a complaint," the officer replied, his voice dripping with casual disdain. "But I'd advise you to cooperate unless you want more trouble." The words hung there, a thinly veiled threat wrapped in arrogance. Emma's heart sank as she gripped Mike's hand, her fingers tightening around his. Their eyes met briefly, a silent conversation passing between them, two souls who knew all too well the futility of reasoning with someone so entrenched in their own authority. She saw the fire in Mike's eyes, the same fire she felt flickering within herself. But they both understood this was a dead-end exchange. Turning to her daughters, Emma summoned a faint smile, her lips trembling slightly with the effort. "Mom and Dad will handle this, don't worry," she murmured, her voice soft as she reached out to stroke each girl's hair. The gesture was tender, a shield against the chaos unfolding around them, but beneath it, her chest tightened with unease. Just then, a shadow loomed closer, a senior officer, his presence commanding yet stern, his sharp gaze fixed on Mike as he gestured toward a secluded corner. "Sir, if you'd step over here for a moment," he said, his tone clipped but carrying an air of finality. Mike hesitated, his jaw clenching as a wave of anger surged through him. The injustice of it all burned hot in his veins, but he nodded reluctantly. Casting a glance back at Emma, he tried to pour reassurance into that fleeting look, though he knew the frustration etched into his features betrayed him. As he followed the senior officer, his footsteps echoed heavily on the tiled floor, each one a testament to the fury he fought to contain. Emma stayed rooted with the children, her arms encircling them protectively as she watched Mike disappear around the corner. She forced her breathing to steady, determined to be the pillar her daughters needed. But inside, a storm churned. Sophie, her eldest, peered up at her with eyes brimming with worry. "Mom, is Dad okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Fragile yet laced with a quiet strength, Emma's heart squeezed painfully. But she managed another smile, this one more practiced. "Dad's fine, honey. He's just talking to the officers." The words felt hollow even to her own ears, a fragile lie to mask the anxiety clawing at her insides. All around them, the stares of security personnel and curious onlookers pressed in like a suffocating tide. Emma felt exposed, a lioness cornered, yet refusing to yield. She'd spent years fighting for justice in courtrooms, defending the rights of others. And now here she watched her own family ensnared in a web of unfairness she couldn't unravel. Across the room, Mike stood rigid, facing the senior officer's barrage of questions. The man's inquiries were absurd, veering into tangents that had no bearing on their situation, questions about destinations, past travels, irrelevant details that seemed designed to waste time. Mike answered with a calm he didn't feel, his voice a low hum of restraint. He knew cooperation was the fastest way out, but when the young officer rejoined the fray, parroting the same pointless queries as if to wear him down, something snapped. Mike's patience frayed like a thread pulled too tight. He straightened, his eyes boring into the young man's. "I've answered all your questions," he said, his tone no longer soft, now edged with steel. "My family has done nothing wrong. We have the right to be treated fairly, just like any other passenger here." The young officer smirked, a flicker of challenge in his expression. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he shot back, sarcasm lacing every syllable, as if the words excused everything. Back with the children, Emma's grip on their hands tightened as she watched the exchange grow heated. Her husband squared shoulders. The young officer's taunting posturite was a powder keg ready to ignite. Her pulse quickened, a fierce resolve blooming within her. She couldn't let this slide, not with her daughters watching, not with the lesson of justice hanging in the balance. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "That's enough," she declared, her voice ringing out clear and commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Our family has complied with every request. We've provided all documents, answered all questions. You have no reason to keep detaining us and treating us like this." The young officer turned, raising an eyebrow in defiance. "We have the right to conduct further checks if we feel it's necessary," he retorted, his arrogance practically tangible. Emma didn't flinch. She closed the distance between them, her gaze unyielding. "I'm a lawyer," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "I know my family's rights. If you have no valid reason to hold us, this is a violation of our freedom." Sophie and Lily, standing just behind her, stared up at their mother in awe. They'd seen her strength before, but never like this, a lioness rising to protect her pride. Their chests swelled with pride, their young minds grasping the gravity of her stand. The senior officer, sensing the situation spiraling, raised a hand to quiet his subordinate. "We're just following protocol, ma'am," he said, his tone softer, an attempt at peace. "No need to escalate this." But Emma wasn't appeased. "Your protocol isn't an excuse for abusing power," she countered, her words sharp and unyielding. "You've seen my husband's badge. You know he's an FBI agent. You can verify it with the office. Holding us without reason is unacceptable." The young officer scoffed, his bravado unshaken. "File a complaint if you want, but for now, stay calm and let us finish our checks," he snapped, impatience coloring his voice. Emma's blood roared in her ears. She couldn't let this arrogance stand, not in front of her children, who deserved to see justice prevail. She met the officer's gaze head-on. "I'm staying calm so my kids don't grow up fearing people like you who misuse authority," she said, her voice a quiet thunder. "But I won't stay silent if you keep treating my family this way. If I have to, I'll see this through to the end and ensure every action here is held accountable." Sophie and Lily's eyes gleamed with admiration, their mother's resolve a beacon in the dim haze of the moment. Chloe and Ava, still clinging to her, looked up with trust, sensing her strength even if they couldn't grasp its full weight. Mike stepped closer, pride and worry warring in his chest. He placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, a silent vow that he stood with her, though he urged calm for their children's sake. The senior officer, now visibly uneasy under the growing scrutiny of onlookers, signaled the young officer to stand down. After a tense pause, the younger man relented, his defiance fading as he muttered, "All right. We'll check with our superiors." The senior officer nodded, his tone conciliatory. "Please, just a few more minutes." Emma said nothing, her gaze still locked on the officers as she gently stroked Ava's hair, soothing her daughters while keeping watch. The girls held each other's hands, their young hearts sensing the wrongness of it all, drawing comfort from their parents' unyielding stance. As the officers stepped away to confer, Emma turned to Mike, her voice low but resolute. "We're not letting this go, Mike." He squeezed her hand, nodding firmly. Together, they stood as a united front, determined to shield their family's dignity. The atmosphere grew heavier, the hum of the airport drowned out by the weight of their ordeal. Passengers began to pause, their eyes drawn to the scene. Some shook their heads in quiet disapproval, while others discreetly raised their phones, capturing the unfolding drama. Emma noticed, a flicker of relief cutting through her resolve, a proof they weren't alone. Sophie, ever observant, caught sight of the filming too. "Mom, they're recording," she whispered, her voice trembling with indignation. "We didn't do anything wrong." Emma's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. Her daughter's words, so pure yet fierce, stoked her determination. The young officer, sensing the shift, glanced nervously at the crowd. His earlier smirk vanished as he whispered to his colleague, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. From the throng, a middle-aged woman's voice rang out, bold and clear. "This isn't right. That family did nothing wrong. Are they holding them so long?" Her words rippled through the onlookers, stirring murmurs of agreement. Emma turned, meeting the woman's gaze with gratitude. In that moment, she felt the power of collective witness, a reminder that injustice couldn't hide in plain sight. Her resolve hardened further. This wasn't just about her family anymore, it was a stand against the abuse of power, a lesson in accountability she'd teach her daughters and anyone watching. As the officers huddled, their voices low, Emma brushed her daughter's hair gently, whispering reassurances. She knew the fight wasn't over, but with Mike by her side and the truth laid bare, they'd see it through to the end. The air in the airport security checkpoint hung thick with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone present. The senior officer, a man whose years of authority had etched deep lines into his weathered face, stood at the center of it all, his posture rigid yet faltering. He turned back to the Johnson family, his sharp eyes softening just enough to hint at an internal struggle. He cleared his throat, the sound awkward and forced, before speaking in a voice he hoped would sound conciliatory. "I ask for your patience. Folks, just a few more minutes while we confirm some details." His words, though carefully chosen, couldn't mask the unease that flickered across his features, a telltale sign that even he wasn't entirely convinced by his own assurances. Emma Johnson stood tall, her presence commanding despite the exhaustion that tugged at her spirit. Her dark hair framed a face set with determination, and her eyes locked onto the officer with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "Our family has been patient from the very start," she said, her tone steady but edged with a quiet strength that refused to bend. "The real question is, what more could you possibly need from us? We're legitimate traveler-schnitt rule breakers, not threats. We don't deserve this relentless scrutiny." Her voice rose ever so slightly, carrying just far enough to ripple through the growing crowd of onlookers, a subtle but deliberate signal that she wouldn't let this injustice pass unnoticed. It was a plea for fairness, wrapped in a challenge to the authority that loomed over them. Nearby, the younger officer, a weary figure with a buzz cut and a demeanor that oozed misplaced confidence, shift at his stance. His earlier bravado had begun to crumble, though he clung to a veneer of detachment, as if distancing himself from the situation might shield him from its consequences. He darted a quick, irritated glance at the passengers who had pulled out their phones, their cameras trained on the unfolding scene. Then, turning back to the Johnsons, he spoke in a clipped, mechanical tone. "Just following standard procedures, ma'am. No need to make this bigger than it is." But the stiffness in his voice betrayed him. Beneath his words lurked a discomfort he couldn't fully hide, a crack in the armor of his authority. Emma shook her head, her patience finally giving way to a simmering anger that she no longer bothered to conceal. "Standard procedures," she repeated, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Tell me, do you apply these so-called procedures to every traveler who passes through here? Or just to families who don't fit the picture you've got in your head?" Her words landed with the force of a thunderclap, striking at the heart of the young officer's smug composure. His face twisted into something sour, a fleeting grimace that revealed how deeply her accusation had stung. Around them, the tension thickened, a palpable current that electrified the air as the crowd began to stir. Voices rose from the onlookers, a chorus of discontent that swelled with each passing second. "That's right, this is blatant discrimination," shouted a man with graying hair and a weathered jacket, his tone sharp with indignation. Others murmured their agreement, their faces a mix of frustration and disbelief. A woman in a bright red coat clutched her phone tighter, her fingers trembling as she recorded, muttering under her breath about posting the video online to expose the ordeal. The passengers' unrest grew louder, a wave of collective outrage that threatened to drown out the officer's authority entirely. The senior officer, sensing the situation slipping beyond his control, pulled the younger man aside for a hushed exchange. Their words were lost in the hum of the crowd, but the younger officer's shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightening as he received what was clearly a reprimand. With a reluctant nod, the senior officer turned back to the Johnsons, his expression strained. "Apologies for the inconvenience," he said stiffly, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "You're free to go. We'll reach out if we need anything further." But there was no warmth in his tone, no genuine remorse, just the grudging concession of a man cornered by circumstance. Mike Johnson, standing beside his wife, let out a faint, bitter laugh, his lips curling into a cynical smile. He knew this sudden leniency wasn't born of goodwill. It was the pressure of the crowd's watchful eyes and the threat of public scrutiny that had forced the officer's hand. He reached for Emma's hand, their fingers interlocking with a quiet strength that spoke of shared resolve. Relief washed over them, but it was tainted by a lingering fury and anger at the baseless humiliation they'd endured, made worse by the wide-eyed stares of their four daughters, who had witnessed it all. Emma knelt down, her knees brushing the cold tile floor as she pulled her girls into a tight embrace. "It's over now," she whispered, her voice soft yet trembling with emotion. "We'll be on our way soon." Sophie, the eldest at 10, gazed at her mother with a mixture of confusion and awe, her young mind grappling with the unfairness she'd just seen. Lily, a year younger, mirrored her sister's expression, her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of it all. Chloe and Ava, the youngest at 6 and 4, clung to Emma's arms, their small hands gripping her tightly as they sought solace from the storm. They couldn't fully understand. The Johnsons began to move away from the security checkpoint, their steps slow but deliberate. Mike and Emma's hearts burned with a fierce determination, a silent vow that this incident wouldn't fade into the background of their lives. The experience had seared itself into their souls, a stark reminder That injustice could strike anywhere, at any time. But more than that, it was a clarion call, a summons to fight back, to ensure no other family would suffer the same indignity. As they walked, the crowd's eyes followed them, phones still raised, capturing every moment of their quiet defiance. It was a testament to the struggle they'd endured, a struggle that spoke not just of personal grievance, but of a broader battle against the misuse of power. Yet the security staff offered no real apology, no explanation, just a curt dismissal that only stoked Emma's outrage further. She knew that letting this slide would mean leaving the door open for others to face the same ordeal. As they approached the waiting area, a new figure emerged from the bustling terminal, a senior airport official. His crisp uniform adorned with a gleaming badge and a name tag that read James Carter. His strides were quick, purposeful, but his face betrayed a nervous energy. The crowd's sympathetic murmurs and disapproving glares followed him, and he forced a polite nod, his lips twitching into a strained smile. "Hello," he began, his voice smooth but overly gentle, as if he could soothe the situation with tone alone. "I'm the head of airport security. I understand there was a misunderstanding during your check. We sincerely apologize if this caused any inconvenience to your family." But before he could finish, Emma stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fire that stopped him cold. "Inconvenience?" she snapped, her voice rising with a resolve that echoed through the terminal. "Let me make this perfectly clear. This wasn't an inconvenience. My family followed every rule you set. We handed over our documents, my husband's badge, our passports, everything. And yet you treated us like criminals. Do you have any idea what my children went through? Standing there while you questioned us for no reason." Her words were a torrent, each one laced with the pain and fury of a mother pushed too far. The official flinched, his composure cracking under the weight of her gaze. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting away from hers as the crowd's scrutiny bore down on him. "We deeply regret this unfortunate experience," he said, his tone faltering. "It could have been handled better. We'll conduct an internal investigation to figure out what went wrong and make sure it doesn't happen again." But his words rang hollow, a weak attempt at pacification that did little to mask his unease. Mike stepped up beside Emma, his broad shoulders squared, his expression as cold as steel. He fixed the official with a stare that cut through the pretense. "An internal investigation," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "We cooperated from the moment we got here, did everything you asked, and still, you treated us like suspects. We don't want your vague apologies, want accountability." His words carried the weight of a man who'd seen justice trampled and refused to let it stand. Sophie, her brown eyes wide and searching, stepped closer to her parents, though young. She understood the gravity of what had happened. She looked up at the official, her voice small but steady. "We didn't do anything wrong, so why did you treat us like that?" It was a question born of innocence, yet it pierced the air with a clarity that made the official squirm. He bent down slightly, his response clumsy and rehearsed. "You're right, little one. Sometimes there are misunderstandings. We just want to keep everyone safe." Emma's lips curled into a sharp, humorless smirk. "Safe?" she countered, her tone dripping with disdain. "Your discriminatory attitude didn't just hurt my family, it showed everyone here that you're abusing your power. I won't stand for that." The official's unease grew, his eyes flickering to the passengers still filming, their phones a silent jury bearing witness to his failure. He turned to the young officer, who lingered nearby, and shot him a pointed look, a silent command to retreat. The younger man's head dipped, his earlier defiance reduced to a faint scowl as he stepped back, chastened but unrepentant. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their voices weaving a tapestry of support. An older man with a gravelly voice called out, "Their family didn't do a damn thing wrong, we all saw it." A woman nearby, her face flushed with anger, added, "Why'd you hold them up so long for no reason? This is outrageous." Their words bolstered the Johnsons, a lifeline of solidarity that made the security official's authority feel small and brittle. He raised his hands in a futile gesture of calm. "I assure you, we'll investigate this thoroughly and take action if there was any wrongdoing," he said, his voice straining to maintain control. "If you'd like to file a complaint, feel free to reach out." But Emma crossed her arms, her stance unyielding, "You don't need to play polite," she said, her words firm and unflinching. "We're not letting this go. We'll contact the authorities ourselves and make damn sure your actions and your team see the light of day." Mike rested a hand on Emma's shoulder, his gaze shifting from tolerance to steely resolve. "My family didn't deserve this," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "And we'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one else has to go through it either." Behind them, Sophie and Lily watched their parents with wide, admiring eyes, their young hearts swelling with pride. They'd never seen their mother and father so fierce, so unshakable, and it planted a seed of strength within them, a realization that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of unfairness, but a cause worth fighting for. The security official, sensing the futility of further words, offered a curt bow. "We'll reach out if there's more to discuss," he muttered, then turned away, ushering the young officer and the rest of the security team out of sight. The air began to clear, the oppressive tension lifting like a storm breaking apart. But for Mike and Emma, this was no ending, it was a beginning. They locked eyes, their hands finding each other in a grip that spoke of unspoken promises. They weren't just fighting for themselves or their daughters. They were standing against a system that wielded power without care, a system that needed to be held accountable. Emma knelt once more, gathering her girls close. "We're not letting this be forgotten," she said, her voice tender yet ironclad. "Your dad and I will do everything we can to protect you, and make sure no one else faces this kind of wrong." The girls nodded, their faces reflecting a quiet trust in their parents' resolve. They understood, in their own way, that this was about more than their family. It was about fairness, about dignity, about the values their parents held dear. As the Johnsons moved toward the gate, the passengers who'd borne witness offered nods of respect, their eyes shining with admiration. The family wasn't alone. Their story had ignited something in those around them, a spark that wouldn't fade. Mike and Emma led their daughters onward, their steps fueled by anger but guided by purpose. They'd been allowed to leave, but the lack of accountability from those in power only deepened their resolve. This wasn't just a personal wound, it was a lesson in justice, a warning of what happens when authority oversteps its bounds. And they would ensure it was a lesson the world wouldn't forget. The airport stretched before them, a sprawling maze of glass and steel, its sterile corridors humming with the restless energy of travelers. For Emma and Mike Johnson, stepping out of the security area with their four daughters trailing behind, was not the triumphant start of a family adventure. It was the opening chapter of a grueling odyssey, one they hadn't chosen, but now felt compelled to endure. Their hands clasped tightly, not just for comfort, but as a silent vow. They moved forward with a steely determination burning in their chests. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. This was about reclaiming justice and dignity for anyone who might one day stand in their shoes. Trembling under the weight of unearned suspicion, exhaustion clung to them like a second skin, etched deep into the lines of their faces. The giddy anticipation that had once bubbled up at the thought of this trip, a rare escape from the grind of daily life, had evaporated, leaving behind a bitter residue of worry and hurt. Emma glanced at her daughters, her heart twisting as she took in their expressions. Sophie, the eldest at 14, walked with her shoulders hunched, her brow furrowed in a way that made her look far older than her years. Lily, 12 and fiercely bold, clenched her fists at her sides, her sharp eyes darting around as if daring someone to challenge her. Chloe, the sensitive 10-year-old, stayed close to her father, her tear-streaked face half hidden behind a curtain of dark hair. And little Ava, just 8, gripped Emma's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened, her wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. The ordeal they'd just endured had carved itself into each of them, a jagged wound that time might soften, but never fully heal. The security checkpoint had been a nightmare, a chaotic blur of raised voices, cold glares, and invasive hands. It started with a routine bag check that spiraled into something far uglier. The officers had singled them out, their questions laced with an edge of disdain that Emma couldn't unhear. "Where are you really from?" one had demanded, his tone implying their answers could never satisfy him. Their passports, their tickets, their very presence of it had been scrutinized as if they were criminals. Masquerading as a family, the children had watched, wide-eyed and silent, as their parents were herded aside, searched, and interrogated for no reason they could name. By the time they were released, with a curt nod and no apology, the damage was done. The joy of their journey had been stripped away, replaced by a simmering anger and a gnawing sense of violation. Sophie broke the heavy silence first, her footsteps slowing as she pressed closer to her mother. Her voice, usually bright and confident, was small and fragile, trembling with a mix of fury and bewilderment. "Mom, why did they treat us like that? We didn't do anything wrong." Her dark eyes locked onto Emma's, searching for an answer that could make sense of the chaos swirling in her mind. She'd always been the thoughtful one, the girl who pondered life's mysteries late into the night. But this was different. This wasn't a puzzle to solve, it was a betrayal, raw and personal, and it shook her to her core. Emma stopped walking, the bustle of the airport fading into a distant hum as she knelt to meet Sophie's gaze. Her hands settled on her daughter's shoulders, steady and warm, though inside she felt a storm raging. She took a deep breath, choosing her words with care, knowing they'd shape how Sophie saw the world from this day forward. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes people don't treat others the way they deserve, and not because of anything they've done, but because of ignorance or prejudice they carry inside. What happened to us was wrong, deeply wrong, but it wasn't our fault. Do you understand that?" Sophie gave a faint nod, but the questions lingered in her eyes, sharp and unyielding. "Then if it was their fault, Mom, why didn't anyone stop them? Why didn't someone make it right?" Her words pierced Emma like a blade, exposing the harsh truth she'd been wrestling with herself. This wasn't just a fleeting injustice, it was a crack in the foundation of the world Sophie had trusted, and Emma couldn't shield her from that revelation. Before Emma could respond, Lily stepped forward, her small frame radiating defiance. Her voice cut through the air, blunt and unapologetic. "You're right, Mom, it's not fair. We're legal passengers. Did they suspect us just because we look different? They had no right." Her words hung there, bold and blazing, and Emma felt a swell of pride tangled with sorrow. Lily had always been the fearless one, quick to call out a wrong. But seeing that fire ignited by such a painful lesson broke Emma's heart. She didn't want her daughters to learn about the world's cruelties so soon, yet here they were, standing in the wreckage of their innocence. Mike, who'd been listening quietly, felt his chest tighten as his daughters' voices washed over him. He knelt beside Lily, resting a hand on her shoulder, then turned to Sophie, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Girls," he said, his tone firm but laced with a tenderness that softened its edges, "you're going to meet people in life who don't understand you, who judge you unfairly because of how you look or where they think you're from. But listen to me, those people don't get to decide what you're worth. You're strong, you're smart, and you're enough, just as you are. Your mom and I will always have your backs, but you need to know you have the right to stand up for yourselves too." His words were a lifeline, a promise forged in the heat of their shared struggle, and he meant every syllable. Nearby, Chloe lingered, her small hands twisting the hem of her sweater. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked up at her father, her voice quavering. "Daddy, I'm scared. I don't understand why they were so mad at us. Why did it have to be us?" The fear in her ice wide and shimmering tore at Mike's heart. Chloe had always been the softest of their girls, the one who cried over a wounded bird or a friend's hurt feelings. This had shaken her fragile world, and he hated that he couldn't erase it. He pulled her into his arms, his hand smoothing her hair as he murmured, "You don't need to be afraid. Chloe, you did nothing wrong, you didn't deserve any of it. You deserve respect, and we're going to make sure you get it." His voice was gentle, but beneath it lay a quiet fury, a resolve to shield his daughter from ever feeling this small again. Yet he knew, deep down, that the memory of this day would linger in her like a shadow. Ava, the youngest, stayed silent, her tiny hands still locked in Emma's. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the checkpoint, but her eyes, big and round and brimming with tears, said everything. Emma dropped to her knees, pulling Ava into a fierce embrace. "It's over now, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm despite the ache clawing at her chest. "Mommy and Daddy will always protect you." She held her daughter close, feeling the rapid flutter of Ava's heartbeat against her own. Ava might not have the words to express it, but Emma knew the weight of this moment had settled into her too. Even at 8, she'd carry this scar, a silent testament to a day when trust was shattered. The family gathered in a tight circle, their daughters pressing close, a fragile fortress against the storm they'd weathered. Emma's gaze swept over their Facessiphi's quiet intensity, Lily's blazing resolve, Chloe's trembling vulnerability, Ava's mute distress, and she felt a fierce determination take root. This wasn't just a trial for her and Mike. It was a lesson their girls would carry forever, one she'd give anything to spare them. But the world didn't bend to a mother's wishes, and so she vowed instead to teach them strength, to show them that unity and resilience could rise from even the ugliest ashes. They settled into the waiting area, a sea of hard plastic chairs and flickering screens, their flight still hours away. Emma and Mike exchanged a look, a silent conversation woven with empathy and ironclad resolve. This wasn't just about surviving the day, it was about teaching their children. They were worthy of respect, that they could demand fairness when it was denied. Mike rested his hand on Emma's shoulder, leaning in to whisper, "We're not letting this fade away, right?" His breath was warm against her ear, his voice a low rumble of conviction. She nodded, her eyes fixed on some distant point, but inside, a fire blazed. Their fight was far from over, and she'd see it through to the bitter end. As they boarded the plane, their daughters clustered around them like a shield. Emma felt a swell of something fierce and unshakable. Her family wasn't just a refuge of love, it was a force, a wellspring of courage to battle for what was right. She couldn't let this story dissolve into the background noise of their lives, couldn't let the wound they'd suffered fester in silence. They had to speak, not just for themselves, but for every family who might one day face the same indignity. Settling into her seat, she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling with purpose as she dialed Ella, her colleague at the law firm. The line clicked, and Ella's familiar voice came through, steady and warm. "Ella, I need your help," Emma said, her tone sharp as steel. "My family was detained at the airport, no reason, just disrespect and blatant unfairness. I want to sue the airport, the staff, everyone involved." Ella didn't hesitate. "I'm with you, Emma. We'll get the truth out there, we've got your back." Her pen scratched against paper as she jotted down every detail. Emma poured out hostile questions, the unwarranted searches, the cold indifference. "Send me any videos or photos you've got," Ella added. "I'll reach out to some media contacts too. This needs to go public, pressure's the only way they'll own up to it." Emma ended the call, a flicker of hope igniting amidst her rage. Ella's support was a lifeline, a promise that their story wouldn't be buried. Moments later, a shadow fell over their seats. One of the security officers approached, his uniform crisp but his face taut with unease. He bowed slightly, his voice strained as he tried to smooth the jagged edges of the moment. "I'm so sorry for what happened. We'll look into it internally if there's any wrongdoing. We'll handle it. I hope your family can let this go." His eyes darted nervously, as if he sensed the storm brewing in the Johnsons' resolve. Emma's gaze hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Let it go," she echoed, her voice low and lethal. "Do you realize this wasn't just a bad day for us? It was discrimination, plain and simple. If we don't speak up, who's going to stop this from happening to someone else?" The officer faltered, his forced calm crumbling under the weight of her words. Around them, passengers turned, some pulling out phones to record, their faces a mix of outrage and solidarity. The crowd's scrutiny only deepened his discomfort, and he stammered on, "We regret this deeply. If you have more complaints, please contact management directly." Emma crossed her arms, her fury a living thing. "An apology isn't enough. My family deserves action, not empty words. We're going to push this until justice is served. No one can hide behind prejudice." In a place like this, Mike's hand found her shoulder, his touch a steady anchor as he met her eyes. "We'll fight to the end," he murmured, then turned to the officer, his voice ringing with quiet power. "My family didn't deserve this, and we'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one else does either. This isn't just our story, it's a wake-up call. No one gets to strip away someone's dignity because of their own biases." The officer's shoulders slumped, his attempts at placation unraveling. He bowed again and retreated, his expression a mix of resignation and dread. He knew this wouldn't stay quiet, the Johnsons wouldn't let it. As he disappeared into the crowd, a ripple of support spread through the onlookers. An older man approached Mike, his weathered hand resting briefly on his arm. "You're doing the right thing," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Don't let them off easy." Others nodded, their whispers weaving a fragile web of encouragement around the family. In that moment, Emma understood the deeper lesson unfolding. Justice wasn't just a gift handed down, it was a fire stoked by those brave enough to demand it. And the consequences of unchecked power, of prejudice cloaked as authority, were a poison that spread unless confronted. She looked at her daughter Sophie's quiet resolve, Lily's fierce indignation, Chloe's fragile courage, Ava's silent trust, and knew they'd carry this truth forward. Together, they'd turn their pain into a beacon, a warning, a call to rise. As the bustling airport hummed with the clamor of hurried footsteps and distant announcements, a stranger's voice broke through the noise, soft yet heavy with empathy. A middle-aged man, his face etched with lines of a life well lived, rested a gentle hand on Emma Johnson's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for everything your family has endured," he said, his tone carrying the weight of genuine sorrow. "I'll make sure your story reaches others. He'll post it online. Let the world see this travesty for what it is." His words weren't just a promise. They were a spark, igniting a flicker of hope in Emma's weary heart. Nearby, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a voice that rang with conviction chimed in, her volume cutting through the crowd. "Don't give up. Keep pushing forward. We're all standing right here with you." Her declaration wasn't mere encouragement. It was a rallying cry, a reminder of the unseen army gathering behind Emma's cause. Emma paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces around her, some familiar, most not. A swell of gratitude surged within her, warm and overwhelming, like a tide washing away the jagged edges of despair. She dipped her head in a quiet nod, a gesture that felt insufficient to express the depth of her appreciation. For so long, she'd carried the burden of this fight alone, but now, surrounded by these voices of support, she felt the ground beneath her shift. She wasn't isolated anymore. The kindness of strangers, raw and unprompted, poured strength into her resolve, reinforcing it like steel forged in fire. Justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a living, breathing force, and she could feel its pulse growing stronger. As the boarding call echoed through the terminal, the Johnson family moved as one toward the gate. Mike, Emma's steadfast husband, walked beside her, his broad shoulders a quiet testament to the battles they'd faced together. Their four daughters trailed closely, a tight-knit cluster of resilience and love. The girls' hands were clasped together, fingers interlocked as if forming an unbreakable chain. Sophie, the eldest at 16, stayed near her mother, her steps deliberate, her chin lifted with a quiet fierceness. Her dark eyes shimmered not with tears, but with a blazing determination that seemed to light the path ahead. "Mom," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, "I need you and Dad to know something. I'm so proud of you both. What you're doing, it's not just about keeping us safe. It's about standing up for what's right, for so many people who can't." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Emma's heart swelled. She reached out, pulling Sophie into a tender embrace, her arms trembling slightly from the weight of emotion. "Sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft but firm, "your dad and I will always fight for what's fair, and I hope one day you'll carry that torch too." Nearby, 10-year-old Lily overheard her mother's quiet vow, and something sparked within her. Her round face, framed by a cascade of chestnut curls, lit up with a sudden clarity. She stepped forward, her small frame radiating a confidence far beyond her years. "I want to fight for fairness too," she declared, her voice ringing out like a bell, clear and unshaken. Emma's breath caught at the sight of the little girl, so bold, so certain, already grasping the magnitude of their mission. Behind her, Chloe and Ava, the youngest at 7 and 5, clung to their parents' sides. Their wide eyes flickered with a mix of trust and curiosity, not fully comprehending the stakes, but instinctively sensing the strength in their family's unity. To them, Mike and Emma weren't just friends, they were pillars, unshakable and true, teaching them lessons far greater than words could convey. In the Johnson household, love wasn't just warmth and comfort. It was a classroom where courage and justice were the curriculum, etched into every embrace, every shared glance. The plane's engines roared to life, a low rumble that vibrated through the cabin As the family settled into their seats, Mike reached for Emma's hand, his grip firm and unwavering, a silent oath woven into the press of his fingers against hers. No matter what storms lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting exchange, there was no need for words, just a deep, unspoken understanding, a mutual promise to see this through. The ascent into the sky marked more than a physical departure. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one fraught with uncertainty, but brimming with purpose. As the aircraft climbed higher, the world below shrank into a patchwork of lights, and Emma let her eyelids drift shut. Her mind wandered back through the years than dignities, the quiet humiliations, the moments when she'd bitten her tongue until it bled. But now, those memories didn't sting as they once had. Fear had given way to something fiercer, a conviction that burned in her chest, steady and unyielding. She would fight not just for her family, but for every soul who'd been dismissed, diminished, or discarded because of how they looked. The flight stretched on, hours blurring into a hum of engines and whispered conversations. Emma's thoughts churned, weaving a tapestry of the past and the future. She pictured the countless others out there, their stories untold, their voices silenced by the weight of unfairness. She imagined the day her daughters would stand tall, not just as her children, but as warriors in their own right, wielding the lessons she and Mike had instilled. Sophie's quiet resolve, Lily's bold declaration, even Chloe and Ava's innocent trust, they were seeds, planted in the soil of this struggle, destined to grow into something mighty. The Johnsons weren't just a family anymore. They were a movement, a living testament to the power of standing firm when the world tried to knock you down. Outside the plane, the night sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of stars that seemed to whisper of possibilities. Mike shifted beside her, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture so small yet so profound. He didn't need to speak, his presence was enough, a rock amid the turbulence of their journey. Across the aisle, the girls huddled together, their heads bent close. Sophie murmured something to Lily, who giggled softly, while Chloe and Ava traced shapes on the foggy window pane, their laughter a quiet melody against the drone of the plane. These were the moments that fueled Emma's fleeting glimpses of joy amid the fight, proof that love could thrive even in the shadow of adversity. Their path wouldn't be easy. Emma knew that. The road ahead loomed with obstacles, systems, cold bureaucracies, and the sneers of those who wielded power without conscience. But the lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above, it was a fire kindled by those brave enough to demand it. And the consequences of power abused, they rippled outward, leaving scars on families like hers, but also igniting a fury that could topple empires. The Johnsons had chosen to harness that fury, to channel it into a force for change. They weren't just seeking retribution for themselves. They were carving out a world where no one would have to endure what they had, a world where dignity wasn't a privilege, but a right. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the family. Emma opened her eyes, her resolve sharper than ever. She thought of the man at the airport, his promise to amplify their story, and the woman whose voice had thundered with solidarity. They were out there, two strangers turned allies, threads in a tapestry of resistance. The Johnsons' journey had transcended their own pain. It had become a beacon, a call to anyone who'd ever felt the sting of injustice. They would keep fighting, not just for their own redemption, but to dismantle the systems that thrived on inequality. And in every step, every battle, they'd teach their daughterson the world that change began with the refusal to stay silent. The wheels touched down with a jolt, and the family gathered their belongings, their movements synchronized by years of closeness. Mike squeezed Emma's hand one last time before they stood, a final tether before they stepped into the unknown. The girls followed, their faces a mix of exhaustion and anticipation, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they moved toward the exit, a unit forged in love and tempered by struggle. The Johnsons weren't just survivors, they were architects of a future where fairness reigned, where the powerless could rise, and where the echoes of their courage would resonate for generations. In their story, there was a truth as old as time. When injustice rears its head, the brave don't boldly build. And with every voice that joined theirs, the world inched closer to something better, something kinder, something just.